reflect on that? Have you decided on that? With regard to return of ambassadors to their workplaces,
Moscow,
return of American ambassador to Moscow and our ambassador to Washington, we agreed that they would return to their service, to their duties. As for the timeline,
the day after tomorrow, that's
tomorrow or the day after, this is pure technicality. We agreed that
the U.S. State Department,
Russian MFA and State Department will start consultations on the whole range of issues
on the
diplomatic cooperation. There's a lot to talk about. A lot of questions have piled up. I believe that both parties, including the United States, seek to find common ground and find solutions. As for Ukraine, indeed, we touched upon this matter. I wouldn't say that we had lengthy conversation on that, but as far as I understood, President Biden, he said that the basis for the Ukrainian settlement should be the Minsk package of measures. As for possible Ukraine accession to NATO, well, we just touched upon this broadly, and there's nothing to discuss here.
That is what
Itar news agency. Please give the floor to Itar.
Question from Itar Tas.
Mr. President, you said that one of the topics was strategic stability. Could you please elaborate on the decisions on this matter? And will Russia and the United States resume or launch negotiations on strategic stability and disarmament, and namely on the New START treaty? Do you plan to start negotiations on
I can hear you.
All right, we're gonna flip over to a different translation option. It's a little difficult to hear this one, so we're hoping our other option is a little clearer. And I think we've done that, so let's depend.
The US and Russia hold special responsibility for strategic stability in the world, judging by the fact that we are the largest nuclear powers in terms of the number of warheads, re-entry vehicles, and delivery means, as well as the quality and the scale of modernity of these weapons. We realize this responsibility, and President Biden took a responsible and timely decision to extend the New START treaty by another 5 years till 2024. Indeed, the question arises, what's next? We agreed that we will launch consultations at the interagency level under the auspices of the US State Department and the Russian Foreign Ministry. Colleagues at the working level will decide on the makeup of these delegations and the venue for negotiations, as well as the schedule of these meetings. Let's give the floor to foreign journalists. CNN, Matthew Chance.
Hi, Matthew Chance from CNN. Thank you very much for giving me this question. First of all, could you characterize the dynamic between yourself and President Biden? Was it hostile or was it friendly? And secondly, throughout these conversations, did you commit to ceasing carrying out cyber attacks on the United States? Did you commit to stopping threatening Ukraine's security? And did you commit to stop cracking down on the opposition in Russia?
Значит, первая общая оценка. Я считаю, что не было никакой враждебности, наоборот, наша встреча происходила, конечно, в принципиальном ключе. У нас по многим позициям наши оценки расходятся, но, на мой взгляд, все-таки с обеих сторон было продемонстрировано желание понять друг друга и искать пути к сближению позиций. Разговор был весьма конструктивен. Что касается кибербезопасности, мы договорились о том, что мы начнем на этот счет консультации. На мой взгляд, это чрезвычайно важно.
I believe it is extremely important.
На себя должен брать какие
As for
обязательства.
responsibilities and who should take
На
them,
вещах, которые,
let me
в общем-то,
brief you on
известны, но
matters that
не широкой
are common
публике.
knowledge,
Из
but probably
американских источников, я просто
not
боюсь
everybody is aware of that.
перепутать название организации,
US
сколько он потом
sources,
передаст. Из
I
американских источников следует,
don't want to make
что
a mistake
наибольшее
here as
количество
to the name of this
кибератак
organization, but
в
the
мире
US sources
осуществляется
claim that
с
the majority of
киберпространства
cyber
США.
attacks are
На
made
втором месте
from
Канада,
the US territory.
затем две латиноамериканские страны,
Then the
и
second
потом
one is
Великобритания.
Canada, then two
Россия
Latin
в этом
American
списке,
states, and then
Россия в
the
этом
UK.
списке
As for
стран,
Russia,
с территории, с
it is
которых,
not
из
listed
киберпространства которых осуществляется
in this
наибольшее
ranking
количество кибератак
of
разного рода,
countries
не
that
значится,
see
как видите.
the significant number of cyber
Второе,
attacks
на
from their
протяжении
territory.
2020
That's
года
one thing.
мы направили, мы получили
Throughout
из США
2020,
запросов,
we
10
have
запросов
received
по поводу
10
кибератак
requests
на
regarding
объекты
cyber
Соединенных
attacks.
Штатов Америки. Как
attacks
говорят наши
on
коллеги,
the US
из
infrastructure.
киберпространства России.
As our colleagues
два таких
put it,
запроса в
these
этом году.
cyber attacks were launched from
На
the
все
Russian
из них, и
territory.
в прошлом
And we
году,
received
и
two
в
such
этом
requests this
наши
year,
коллеги получили
and on all these
исчерпывающий
requests,
ответ.
our colleagues
В
received
свою очередь,
exhaustive
Россия
answers.
направила
On its turn,
в прошлом году
Russia sent
соответствующие
last
структуры
year
США 45 таких запросов,
45
а в
such
первом полугодии
requests
этого года
to the relevant
35.
agencies of the United States,
Ни
and this
одного
year
ответа мы до сих
we
пор не
sent
получили.
35 requests, and
говорит о
no
том, что нам есть над
response
чем
has been
работать.
provided so far.
И
That
вопрос о
says
том,
that
кто,
we have a
в
lot
каком
to
объеме, по поводу
work
чего
on,
должен брать
and
на себя
as for the
обязательства, должен
scale
решаться в ходе
of
переговорного
responsibilities
процесса.
and who should
Договорились, что
take them,
консультации мы такие
it
начнем.
should be decided within
считаем,
negotiations.
что,
We agreed that we would start such consultations, and we
Сфера
believe that
кибербезопасности является
the
чрезвычайно важной в
cybersecurity
мире
area is
вообще,
extremely important
для
in the world
Соединенных
at large, for the
в
United
частности,
States in
и для
particular,
России тоже в таком же объеме.
as well
Вот,
as
например,
for the Russian
мы знаем
Federation to the
о
same
кибератаках
extent.
на
For instance, we know about
трубопроводную компанию
cyber
США.
attacks
Знаем
against
также, что компания вынуждена
pipeline
была заплатить 5
organization in the
миллионов
United States, and we know that this company had to pay a ransom of 5
часть
million
денег,
USD.
по моей информации, уже вернули.
According to my information, they were
из-за электронных
returned
кошельков,
some
а
parts
часть
of
нет.
this money from electronic wallets,
Но при
but
чем здесь
some parts
государственные
of this
органы
money is still
России?
missing. But
Значит,
what
мы
does
сталкиваемся
and
с
what
такими
do
же
Russian
угрозами, в частности, например,
authorities
на
have to do this? We
систему
face the
здравоохранения
similar
одного из крупных регионов
threats
Российской Федерации.
when it
И мы,
comes
конечно же, мы
to one
видим,
of the
откуда
key
происходит
Russian
атаки.
regions
Видим, что
and its
эта
healthcare
работа
system,
координируется
and we
из
see where these cyber attacks are launched
киберпространства
from.
США.
We see that these attacks are
Я не думаю, что Соединенные Штаты,
coordinated
официальные
from
власти,
the United
заинтересованы
States
в
territory.
манипуляциях
I
подобного
don't
рода.
think
Нужно
that the United
просто
States
отбросить
authorities
всякие
are interested in such kind of manipulations. We need to get rid of
экспертном
all kinds of
уровне
insinuations and
сесть и
innuendo,
начать работать
and we
в
should
интересах
launch the
Соединенных
expert
Штатов
work
и Российской
for the
Федерации.
benefit
Мы,
of the United
в
States
принципе, об
and the
этом
Russian
договорились,
Federation. We
и
have
Россия к
reached
этому
an
готова.
agreement in principle of that,
Жень,
and
давайте
Russia is ready
RT.
to
Где
do
у нас
that.
RT?
RT.
Я знаю. RT. Дайте микрофон RT, пожалуйста.
Please give the mic to
Дайте
RT.
микрофон, что какая-то часть вопроса была, осталась неотвечена.
Yeah, I believe some part of the question was not answered.
That's correct, and thank you very much for coming back to me, sir. So there were two other parts of the question. The first one is, did you commit in these meetings to stop threatening Ukraine? Remember, the reason this summit was called in the first place, or the timing of it, was when Russia was building up lots of forces across the border from Ukraine. And the second part of the question, the third part of the question, was, did you commit to stopping your crackdown against the opposition groups inside Russia led by Alexei Navalny?
Значит, ну, я не слышал эту часть вопроса, или ее не
To be
перевели,
honest,
или вы
this part of the
просто
question was not
подумали и решили
interpreted, or
задать второй
maybe
вопрос. Что
you
касается
decided to
обязательств
ask
по
a second
поводу
part of your question.
Украины,
But with
у
regards
нас
to
обязательство только одно
commitments to
способствовать
Ukraine,
реализации
we
Минских
have one single
соглашений.
commitment
Если
to help
украинская
and
сторона готова к
facilitate the
этому, мы
implementation of the
пойдем
Minsk
по этому
agreements.
пути.
If
Без
Ukrainian
всякого
side is
сомнения.
ready to do that, we are
Между
ready
прочим,
to
хочу
follow
обратить
this
ваше
path
внимание на
without
следующее.
any
Еще
doubts.
в ноябре прошлого
Let
года
me draw your attention to one thing. in November 2020, the Ukrainian delegation presented its ideas on how it intends to implement the Minsk agreements. And it's not a confidential document. It stipulates that, first of all, proposals on the political integration of Donbas to the Ukrainian legal system should be presented, as well as to the Constitution. To this end, Constitution should be amended. It is stipulated there. That's the first thing. And secondly, borders between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, the Donbas line, these security situations should be ensured the next day after the election. That's Article 9. So what did Ukraine propose? As a first step, it proposed to return the Ukrainian armed forces to their permanent stationing areas. That means that Ukrainian armed forces should be deployed in Donbas. That's the first thing. And secondly, they proposed to close Ukrainian-Russian border in this area. And third, to hold elections 3 months after these two steps. One doesn't need to be a lawyer, and one doesn't need to have a special experience to understand that it has nothing to do with the Minsk agreements. It contradicts fully to the Minsk agreements. So what kind of additional obligations should Russia take here? I believe that the answer is pretty understandable. As for the exercises, we're holding these exercises in our territory, just like the United States does with regard to many drills. But we do not hold our exercises by deploying the military equipment close to the US border. Unfortunately, that's what the American partners are doing with regard to our border. So we need to have these concerns, not them. But this is the subject of discussion and of clarifying positions. With regard to our non-systemic opposition and a citizen that you have mentioned, first, this person knew full well that he violates the law that exists in Russia, and he had to understand that he is a person that is a repeated offender. He deliberately violated this law. He went abroad to receive medical treatment, and once he went out of hospital and posted his videos online, a requirement appeared, but he ignored the requirement of the law, and he knew full well that he is wanted. Nevertheless, he came back to Russia, and he deliberately wanted to be arrested. So he did what he wanted to do. What can we say here? With regard to persons like himself and the systemic opposition at large, unfortunately, the format of the press conference does not allow us to have a detailed conversation of that. But let me say the following. I believe that it's pretty simple, and it would be clear to everyone. And if you could just have an unbiased coverage of this, I would appreciate it. So the United States declared Russia as its enemy and adversary, and the Congress made it back in 2017. The US legislation have provisions that the United States should support the order and rule of democratic order in our country and support democratic organizations. And it is all contained in your legislation. So let us ask a question. If Russia is an enemy, then what kind of organizations would be supported by the United States and Russia? I believe these are not organizations that make Russia stronger, but those who deter Russia. And that is the goal of the United States that they made public. So these are organizations and people that help implement the US policy on the Russian track. So what should be our take on this? I believe that clearly we should be cautious about it, but we would be guided and we would react within the Russian law.
Дайте Павлу Зарубину микрофон. А потом на RT вернемся.
Павел Зарубин, ВГТРК, но вот я как раз хотел продолжить эту тематику. Мы и сейчас тоже все с вами свидетели, что с американской стороны постоянно звучит вот эта риторика о так называемых политических заключенных в России. А вот тема Навального, она вообще обсуждалась в ходе ваших переговоров с Байденом? И как обсуждалась, если обсуждалась? И еще один важный вопрос. Мы все были свидетелями, конечно, что, скажем так, новый этап в российско-американских отношениях при старте президентства Байдена начался с очень грубого высказывания в ваш адрес. Вот по этому поводу как-то удалось, может быть, объясниться? Спасибо.
Президент Байден затрагивал тему прав человека и
President
людей,
Biden has
которые
indeed touched on the subject of
считают,
human
что они
rights
представляют
and the subject
те
of
вопросы
people
в
who
Российской
think
Федерации.
who
Мы говорили
they
об этом
are
по его
fully
инициативе.
in tune with the subject,
Первое. Второе,
with
по
this topic in
поводу резких
Russia. We've
заявлений.
discussed this.
Ну, что
We've discussed harsh statements as
все мы
well.
знаем эти заявления. После этого президент Байден мне позвонил.
He called me right afterwards. He explained himself, and I was fully all right with what he said. He offered to meet. I mean, this was his initiative. We've met.
И, повторяю, разговор был
once again,
весьма конструктивный.
the conversation was quite constructive. And I once again understood that President Biden is an experienced statesman. Our one-on-one conversation took almost 2 hours. It's not
Что касается различного рода обвинений, но вспомните, его предшественник, ему задали такой же вопрос, он уклонился.
I mean, his predecessor was asked the same question. He evaded this. This president decided to respond to the question directly. And in this, he is very different from President Trump.
В принципе, все, что происходит в наших странах, так или иначе, за это несет ответственность политического руководства. И первый лица. Вот по поводу того, кто и где, и в чем виноват, кто убийца. Вы посмотрите, на улицах американских городов каждый день кого-то убивают, в том числе и лидеров различных организаций. Там слова не успеешь сказать, уже стреляют, либо в грудь, либо в спину. Вне зависимости от того, рядом с тобой дети, или человек просто, вот я помню, бросила машину женщина, побежала, ей в спину стреляют, застрелили.
A woman just ran away from the police and they shot her in the back.
Афганистан возьмем.
But
Там одним
take
ударом по
Afghanistan.
120 человек убивали, свадьбу
One
уничтожали.
single
Раз,
strike
два.
can kill
Допустим, это
20 people.
Такое тоже
All right,
бывает.
assuming this was a mistake,
Но
it
расстрелы
happens on a war.
беспилотников
But
или
shooting from a drone
вертолетов
at an
явно
unarmed
гражданских
crowd,
лиц в Ираке.
clearly the
Явно
civilian
гражданских
crowd,
лиц. Это что такое?
what is this about? How would you call that? And who's responsible for this? And how would you call this person who is the killer
Или по
now?
правам человека.
Or going back to the human rights
Но
record.
Гуантанамо до сих пор работает.
The Guantanamo
Вообще
prison
не
is still
соответствует
operating.
ничему.
It doesn't even start to resemble what is stipulated in the international law or in the US legislation. And yet it exists.
Тюрьмы, ЦРУ, которые были открыты в
Secret
разных
CIA
странах,
prisons across the globe, including those in the European countries, where people were tortured.
права человека?
Well, is this the great human rights record?
Думаю, что нет. Правда?
Oh, I doubt
Вряд ли
that.
кто-то из сидящих в зале согласится, что так
Would
защищают
anyone
права
here
человека.
would agree
Это же
that this is how
практика.
you protect the human rights?
Реальный
But this are facts on the
Мы,
ground.
исходя из этих
And
практик,
this is the
понимаем,
reality
что это
of the
делалось
politics
и
today. And
может
we
делаться,
understand
выстраивая своё
that
отношение к тому,
this is
о
how
чём я
it's
сейчас скажу,
been done. And
в том числе и к тем лицам,
on the basis of
которые
that, we
получают
respond.
деньги из-за рубежа, чтобы
So when
отстаивать
people get funding
интересы
from
тех, кто
abroad
им платит.
to stand for the hidden agenda of those who are paying them, who pays the piper. RT now,
Мурат
please.
Газдиев, РТ. Вопрос про Арктику. Вы
A
говорили, что
question
они
about the Arctic.
разговаривали.
You've
США уже
mentioned
долгое время
the discussion
обвиняют
on this track,
Россию
and
в
the United States have been
Арктики.
accusing Russia of militarizing
Тоже вот мы слышали
the Arctic.
недавно от секретаря
And so do
Блинкена.
the
Это в мае
United States
его озабоченность
allies.
о
In March,
действиях российских военных.
State
Что
Secretary
именно
Blinken
говорил?
voiced his concern. So what have you discussed
Эту
in
тему мы
detail?
обсуждали в широком формате.
Well, we've discussed this in an extended format with our aides present, and this is an interesting field. I mean the exploration of the Arctic and in general, and of Northern Sea Route in particular, is of huge interest for many countries, not just us in the United States. So yes, the United States have concerns, but they are completely baseless. I mean, these concerns about the militarization are baseless. We are not doing anything new. We are simply restoring the infrastructure that has already been there. All right, we are retooling this, we are retrofitting this, the borderline infrastructure, the military infrastructure, but also the environment conservation and emergency command and search and rescue infrastructure. We are creating the capacity to save people at sea, if that, God forbid, happens, or we're trying to protect the environment. I've told our colleagues that I see no grounds for concern whatsoever. Quite the opposite. I think there's plenty of ground for cooperation, and we should cooperate in this. After all, Russia and the United States are one of the 8 members of the Arctic Council. And by the way, Russia chairs the Arctic Council this year. Moreover, as you probably know, there's a strait between Alaska and Chukotka. On one side you have the United States, and other Russia. All this taken together should actually prompt us to work together to redouble the effort. And the use of Northern Sea Route, its use is regulated by the international law. There are 2 major regulations. There's the Law of the Sea of the United Nations, that dates back to 1982, if I'm not mistaken, and the Polar Code, which is comprised of several documents, which was ratified in 2017. So that's the legal framework. So I drew the attention of our counterparts to this and to the fact that we, Russia, fully stand ready to stand by these international regulations. We have never infringed upon any of them. We stand ready to lend a helping hand to all the countries and companies who wish to explore the possibilities of Northern Sea Route. Now the navigation is open for half a year, but in fact it's more than that. And as the planet warms, this navigation will be open for a longer time. New icebreakers, including the Leader icebreaker, are put online, and we have the mightiest icebreaker fleet in the world. So this proves the much demand for the use of Northern Sea Route. Now, the Law of the Sea of the United Nations describes and sets the legal framework in and around of of the international waters, territorial waters of the country, adjacent seas, exclusive economic zone, and the freedom of the sea, the internal seas. What is that? These are the seas that lie within the sovereign territory of the country. Then the territorial sea, 12 miles, adjacent sea, 12 more miles. In terms of adjacent seas, the country in question should give the right of passage, the free and peaceful right of passage, even to the military ships. Well, do we object? No, we don't. Now, the internal seas is something different. We're not obliged to provide anyone anything. But bear in mind this, the territory of the internal seas, I think it's, well, 5 of them, the Obsk territory, Pskov, the Bay, and some others. The length of this is to the tune of 1,000 nautical miles. Well, this is a sovereign right that we enjoy, whether we want to give the right of passage. But we're not abusing this right. Last year alone we had 1,000 requests to cross them. And I think we've only rejected 10 requests, and the majority of them is the ships that fly the Russian flag. And the regulating agencies deem them unfit to comply with the Polar Code. And the Polar Code itself, Polar Code proper, defines and spells out the requirements for the ships that are crossing these seas. So take us all together, the stakeholder states, members of the Nordic Council. We can do much good together. There are plenty of things for concerns and for contradictions, but I think that there's no issue that cannot be solved if we engage in an earnest effort. NTV.
Good relations, or at least not poor relations, between Russia and America were always the guarantor of calm international relations. And you talked with Biden. Biden agreed on some matters. Now you're talking about respect. You said that your talks were characterized by that. Before the talks, you talked about red lines. And Americans have some red lines. During the talks, were you able to reach an agreement about not crossing the red lines in all areas? Is that something that would improve the relations or at least stabilize the relations? Well, I can say that on the whole, we understand what our American partners are saying. They understood what we were saying. I mean, when we're talking about red lines. But I have to be frank. Of course, we didn't get to the point where we were talking in depth about where the line would be drawn. We talked about work on cybersecurity. We talked about strategic stability. I think that during these consultations, incidentally, also all of this should be discussed, and I hope that we can agree upon it. I'm including the Arctic matters in that too. ABC News, our American branch.
Mr. President, thank you so much for taking my question. President Biden has said that he would respond if cyber attacks from Russia do not stop. I'm curious, what did he tell you? Did he make any threats? And a quick follow-up, if I may, sir. The list of your political opponents who are dead, imprisoned, or jailed is long. Alexei Navalny's organization calls for free and fair elections, an end to corruption. But Russia has outlawed that organization, calling it extremist. And you have now prevented anyone who supports him to run for office. So my question is, Mr. President, what are you so afraid of?
Okay. Once more, let me reiterate what was already said about various so-called foreign agents and about people who are positioning themselves as the non-systemic opposition. I already answered your colleague from CNN, right? But this is the law of the genre, so I have to answer your question, please. I'll do it again. The United States has adopted a law in accordance with which the U.S. has said that they will support various political organizations in Russia. At the same time, they made an announcement that the Russian Federation is an enemy. They've spoken publicly, saying that they will restrain the development of Russia. Here's a question. What organizations, what political organizations of the United States and other members of the Western community, which organizations should be supported in Russia, especially if they're paying for them? We're just like the Americans back, the way the Americans did back in the 1930s. We're calling them foreign agents. But it's not prohibited. They're not prohibited from working. They can continue to operate. Foreign agents don't need to stop operating. If they are extremist in nature, then that's another issue. The organization that you mentioned has publicly called for mass disorder. They have publicly called for breaking the law. They called for minors to participate in activities that were against the law. And they were talking about using Molotov cocktails against the authorities as well, including against police. America just recently had very severe events after well-known events after a killing of an African American. And an entire movement developed known as Black Lives Matter. I'm not going to comment on that, but here's what I do want to say. What we saw was disorder, destruction, violations of the law, etc. We feel sympathy for the United States of America, but we don't want that to happen on our territory. And we're doing our utmost in order to not allow it to happen. And some fears that has nothing to do with anything. Please. Could you give me the microphone, please?
You didn't answer my question, sir. If all of your political opponents are dead, in prison, poisoned, doesn't that send a message that you do not want a fair political fight?
As for who is killing whom or throwing whom in jail, people came to the U.S. Congress with political demands. 400 people. Over 400 people had criminal charges placed on them. They faced prison sentences of up to 20, maybe even 25 years. They're being called domestic terrorists. They're being accused of a number of other crimes. 70 of them were arrested right away after the events, and 30 of them are still under arrest. It's unclear on what grounds. And as for nobody from the official authorities has informed us about it. Some people died, and one of the people that died, they were simply shot on the spot by the police, although they were not threatening the police with any weapons. In many countries, the same thing happens in our country. I'd like to stress once more that we sympathize with what happened in the United States, but we have no desire to allow the same thing to happen in our country. Just a couple of more questions, because later the President will continue his program. Please hand over the microphone.
Удалось ли с американской
стороной
договориться о возвращении некоторых россиян, которые отбывают наказание в американских тюрьмах? Если да, то когда это может произойти?
In American prisons? If yes, then when will it happen? We talked about it. President Biden raised that question. The question about American citizens that were in Russian prisons. We discussed that. There could be some compromise that we enter into between the Russian Foreign Ministry and the U.S. State Department. They will be working on it. The Russia channel. Russia 1. You said that you discussed trade with Mr. Biden. That's probably the most positive agenda. Business from both ends are interested in development. What are the prospects that you see here? Thank you. This doesn't depend on us. It depends on the Americans. We haven't leveled any restrictions. What I think is after some restrictions were introduced in the economy and in commerce, I think that was done much more by the U.S. than by Russia. Yes, this did affect some of our development. The U.S. is carrying out their task of restraining Russia, but they didn't have any critical effect. That's number one. Number two, this has to do with the interests of American businesses. 200 people, the biggest delegation of Americans. It was an American delegation. That delegation was at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. Some restrictions were introduced, including for American companies. Due to that, some of the American companies have lost out. They've given up the business into the hands of their competitors from other countries. We talked about that. What for? There's no practical reason that there are losses. As for our trade with the U.S., I think it's $28 billion, roughly, in the first. It increased by 16% in the first quarter of this year. If this trend continues, I think that will be a benefit for everybody. Sure, you know what, let's have a couple of questions from here and a couple of questions from here, all right? The lady here, please. Andrea, let the lady ask a question. Mr. President, thank you very much for affording me the opportunity to ask you a question. A few years ago, you met President Biden. That was when he was vice president. What he said was that he looked you in the eye, and he said that he didn't see a soul. And you said, that means we understand one another. Did you, tell me please, did you look him in the eye and what did you see there? Did you see a person with whom you can work? And please tell me, President Biden, did he invite you to visit the Russian White House? And if, the White House rather, and if yes, did you agree to go to the White House? President Biden did not invite me as his guest. I didn't invite him either. I think for visits like that, for meetings like that, you need to have the proper conditions. You need to be ready. As for the soul, seeing it or not seeing something, well, this isn't the first time I've heard this. Frankly speaking, I don't recall this conversation, but I will allow that it happened and it escaped my attention. But if you ask me, what sort of a partner, what sort of a conversational partner Biden is, I'd say he's very constructive, he's very balanced, just the way that I expected. He's very experienced, you can tell that at first glance. But he talked about his family, recalling them. He talked about what his mom said. You know, these are important things. They're not directly related to any matters directly, but it shows the extent of his moral values, and that's all quite attractive. And what I think is, on the whole, we spoke the same language. That doesn't mean that we necessarily have to look into our eyes, look into our souls. We need to have eternal friendship and love. But no, we have to represent our countries. And the relationship is a pragmatic one, primarily. Yes, please. Andrei Kolesnikov from Kommersant, the newspaper. Mr. Putin, based on the outcome of this meeting, did you have any new illusions? Well, I didn't have any old illusions. What about new ones? No illusions. There are no illusions, and there could not be any illusions. Okay, over here, raising your hand. Yeah. Please. Give her the microphone. The young lady can decide herself whom to give the microphone to. Hello, I'm from the channel Zvezda. Mr. Putin, a question about global climate change. Did you speak with President Biden about that? And the second question has to do with American media. Recently, you gave a big interview to NBC. Do you think that it is fair to give the American president's do you think it's fair to give an interview to the American media when it doesn't happen the other way around? And how do you feel about having your words always being distorted? You know what? About the distortion, about silencing things, well, that is the practice in international relations today. What can you do? Can't do anything about it. We've gotten used to that a long time ago, and we're all living with it. We've been living with it for decades. As for who's giving an interview, that decision is taken by the relevant leaders or countries. And if you want to convey something in addition to people, then, well, we try to do that. I gave an interview to the American press, and that's exactly what I was trying to do there. As for the activities of our mass media in general, for example, President Biden raised the question about freedom, about the freedom of Europe and Russia, I think. or rather Radio Free Europe, which we called a foreign agent. Biden broached that. Before that, there were other media outlets. There's also Sputnik, a media outlet working abroad. And before that, the United States called Sputnik a foreign agent. And what we did in response, what we did with regard to the Voice of America. And this is done in accordance with the law, registration, etc. And a lot of problems have been created for our personnel with money transfers and that sort of thing. We don't have that kind of a problem. And for American medias, the American media hasn't complied with all of the requirements of Russian law. I think that even here, we can work through the ministries of foreign affairs to resolve matters. Let's go over here, sure. Okay, I was referring to the lady there. But sure, yeah, you can go next. Thank you very much. Galina Polonska from Euronews. Galina Polonska, Euronews. We all saw you shake Joe Biden's hand at the very beginning. Here's my question. Were you able to bring mutual understanding and trust to a different level with the President of the United States? Do you think it's realistic at this juncture to have a new level of relations when where they're absolutely clear and transparent? And will there be an understanding of where both countries need to go to? Let me tell you, in life, there is no happiness. There's only the specter of happiness. I think in this situation, there's not like family-based trust. But I think that there was some specter of trust that we caught a glimpse of. Please. Please, the microphone. You already have a microphone. You want a second one, huh? This one wasn't turned on. Thank you. The coronavirus is one of the most important issues on the planet now. Was this issue discussed with the American president? And if yes, what are the prospects for joint work with the Americans in order to curb this plague? And perhaps you talked about mutual recognition of vaccines. We did talk about that, but we only touched on it tangentially. We answered a request by the Americans to send our equipment as humanitarian assistance. America is a big, powerful country. It's not like they don't have money. Just at that point, they really needed our equipment, and we did it free of charge. And we're prepared to continue cooperation on these lines in the future, but we didn't talk about it in general. We didn't talk about it in detail, rather, today. With regard to President Trump, after those meetings, the relations between the two countries deteriorated further. Is there any indication that that won't happen again? Did we reach in our relationship with the U.S. some sort of a low point that we can push off from and go up? That's difficult to say now. That's because all of the activities that have to do with worsening the relations, all of the actions that did that were not initiated by us. I don't know. Please.
Alexander Gamov, Комсомольская правда.
Alexander Ganov, Komsomolskaya Pravda. I'm not sure if you know, but our team won. Congratulations.
Допустим, с таких же позиций встречу Байдена и Путина. Какой счет у этой встречи?
So what do you think is the score in the Putin-Biden meeting? And the second question. The Americans, before coming to Geneva, they kept on saying, we're going to put pressure on Putin, we're going to put pressure on Russia. Did you feel that pressure? Was there any conflict? That's probably the most important question that Russia's interested in. That's it, I think. Another thing. You know, I think that's pretty much enough. I think so too. We didn't experience any pressure, although there was a candid and open conversation, and there were no personal or diplomatic deviations from the topics we set out to address. So let me repeat once more. There was no pressure from either side. It would be senseless to do that, too. That's not the reason why people meet each other. What was the first part of your question? Oh, the score. Well, I think before our meeting, President Biden said that it wasn't a sporting event, and I fully agree with that. What's the point of keeping score? The meeting had results. It was substantive. It was concrete. And it took place in an atmosphere that was geared toward achieving results. First and foremost, the specter of trust that our colleague from Yavor News talked about. Please, BBC News, go ahead.
Stephen Rosenberg, BBC News. Vladimir Vladimirovich, Joe Biden
Joe Biden is calling for stable, predictable relations with Russia. But on the West, it's believed that the unpredictability is a feature of Russian foreign policy. Are you prepared to renounce unpredictability for the sake of improving relations with the West? Thank you. I envy you for the level of artistry you've achieved here. So, turning to the first, as for the first question, do you think, and then the second question, are you, the first question, the West considers, and secondly, are you prepared to renounce it? Just because the West believes that to be the case, it doesn't mean that it is the case. Let's turn to the first part of the question. You said that the West believes that Russia's foreign policy is unpredictable. Let me answer that. When the U.S. exited the ABM treaty for no reason, why did they do that? That had an effect on strategic stability, and now the withdrawal from the INF in 2012. What's stable about that? There's nothing stable about that at all. Withdrawal from the Open Skies Treaty. What's stable there? There's practically nothing left. But luckily, Joe Biden is addressing the area of strategic stability. He has made quite a sound decision to extend the START treaty. Wow. Let's take the situation surrounding Ukraine and Crimea. Everybody's dancing around that, right? What is stable about the fact that a state coup d'etat was organized in Ukraine, where President Yanukovych agreed with all of the demands of the opposition? He was prepared, in essence, to leave power and to hold new elections. No. There was a need to carry out a bloody coup d'etat, which led to results that are well known, and well known in East Ukraine. And you think that we're unpredictable? No, I don't think so. In my view, we are acting absolutely appropriately to counter threats that are emerging against us. And I think for the situation to be truly stable, we need to reach an agreement on proper rules of conduct in all the areas that we talked about: strategic stability, cybersecurity, tackling issues that have to do with regional conflicts. I think that we can reach an agreement on everything. At least today, the impression arose, that impression arose based on the outcome of our meeting, my meeting with Mr. Biden. What? We're going to start singing songs now? Blue fog, deceit. Well, now our foreign colleagues aren't going to understand that reference. Okay, let's give the floor to one of the foreign outlets, Bloomberg, please. I have a follow-up question.
Bloomberg News или Archivov? Vladimir Vladimirovich.
Bloomberg News.
Вот у вас в 2016 году после встречи с Трампом
In 2016, you met with Trump. After that, American sanctions were adopted. Well, the latest round were adopted very quickly. Did you talk with Joe Biden about the guarantees that you would have for these sanctions to be lifted, or rather for new sanctions not to be introduced against Russia? And you said that there's some incipient hope. With regard to Biden,
тех начальных договоренностей, о которых вы сегодня
you
разговаривали,
mentioned some
больше
initial
доверия, уверенности, что он это сможет
agreements.
сделать,
Do you have
потому
more
что
trust that he'll
считается,
be able to do
что
it?
государственный американский аппарат
Because
более
it's believed
солидарен
that
с линией президента США
the
сейчас, чем
American administration has more solidarity with the American president than was the case during Donald Trump's term. You talked about cybersecurity. You had consultations on Ukraine. I wasn't sure, was there a working group on cybersecurity? And you talked about some red lines. Did you lay out the red lines specifically about that? Can you tell us about that? Well, let's turn to the red lines. I've already addressed that many times. The understanding arises during negotiations on key areas of our interaction. It makes no sense to try to scare one another. When people sit down at the negotiating table in order to establish relations, not to intimidate each other. As for these sanctions, as for restrictions on economies,
мы не знаем, каково настроение там внутриполитические, не знаем расклад сил. То есть мы знаем, но мы не можем до деталей там понять происходящие события.
We know the general situation, but we can't say what's happening in detail. So there's some who are against Russian development. There's some who are proponents of it. It's difficult to say which side is prevailing. But if after our meeting some steps are taken, the ones that you recalled in 2016, then what will that mean? That will mean that will mean that we've lost the latest opportunity. Please. One final question from a journalist from Canada.
I'm Tamara Teresco from Radio-Canada. You said to a couple of my colleagues you wanted unbiased. Do you have a translation?
No.
Do you hear me now?
No.
По-русски?
Не хотят Канаду включить.
Yeah, they didn't want to.
Нет перевода.
There's no interpretation. I can't hear it.
I will try and repeat.
Сейчас, может, на другой канал перейдут. Попробуйте.
Maybe you will try it on a different channel.
Нет, я не слышу.
Yeah? No, I can't hear anything. I don't hear anything whatsoever.
Сейчас, секундочку.
1 second.
Извините, пожалуйста.
Sorry.
Есть звук. Повторите, пожалуйста, сначала.
Thank you.
Sorry, please, if you wouldn't mind repeating.
Tamara Teresco from Radio-Canada in Moscow. You said to a couple of my colleagues you wanted unbiased, fair questions and coverage. I have a fair question for you. It actually comes from my 9-year-old daughter, who asked me before I left to come here, what is the big deal with the summit? And it's quite a complicated answer for a 9-year-old. So I'd like you to explain to us, in your own words, Mr. President, why is this relationship so complicated? And also, she'd like to know, and I'd like to know, why are young people not allowed to protest in Russia?
Да, это здорово, что ваша
пятилетняя дочь интересуется этими вопросами. It's great that your 9-year-old daughter is interested in these questions. The answer is very simple.
Вокруг себя и сказать, видишь, как прекрасно.
You need to look around yourself. You need to see how beautiful the world is.
Взрослые люди, руководители двух стран,
and adults, the leaders of 2 countries, the biggest nuclear powers, are meeting. They're doing that in order to make the world safer, more reliable, and a place for everyone, a home for everyone to flourish, for all those who live on our planet. And they're doing that, they're addressing issues that have to do with a terrible weapon, which needs to be limited. They need to draw up common rules on refraining from using those weapons. They talked about protecting the environment, about rivers being clean, about seas being clean, about there not being any floods, not being any droughts, about providing food to everyone on the planet, no matter where they are. They'll talk about issues of healthcare, so that when children grow up, they get sick less often, they have the opportunity to study, and they have the opportunity to look at the future confidently. And I hope that at our meeting, I hope that you will cover our meeting based on those considerations in particular. I thank you for your attention. All the best.
good time for people like us. Everything's starting up.
This is not just another streaming app.
You might want to hold on to something.
This is a mountain of original, bingeable entertainment.
It's just the beginning. The world is now a blank page.
That's why we're here, to save each other.
This is chilling, unsettling, and brilliantly bonkers. Oh, This is weird and hilarious, stylish and cheeky.
I imagine she dreams of casting me aside like an old shoe.
Oh, honey, you know I'd never throw away a shoe.
This is a joy to watch, a wonder to explore, and a peak TV experience.
We are such stuff as dreams are made of.
I'm so happy! Yay! Live sports, breaking news, and a mountain of entertainment. Paramount Plus, now streaming.
Football, soccer, whatever you want to call it, it's huge. It's the best and biggest competition. You have a golden opportunity, now or never. Oh, yes!
Oh, they got it!
Unbelievable!
It's not over yet.
The UEFA Champions League. Stream every match live on Paramount Plus.
Let's get this party started.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Paramount Plus. This is strokes of genius, beautiful games, and one shining moment. This is Defenders, Investigators, and
7 strangers picked to live in a house.
This is young SpongeBob, young Sheldon, and younger. This is everything you've been looking for.
That's gonna leave a mark.
Live sports, breaking news, and a mountain of entertainment.
All right.
This is Paramount Plus, now streaming.
Whose stories are worth telling? Who's worth hearing? Never let anyone decide that for you.
This is not just another streaming app. This is love taps, death traps, and whip snaps. Oh, This is things that go boom and things that go boom. This is justice. This is fearless.
This is business.
This is all the drama you can handle.
You must go. Make your stand.
Live sports, breaking news, and a mountain of entertainment. Paramount Plus, now streaming.
That bird has been staring at me. It's been there for 10 minutes.
Okay.
I didn't know we were coming, or I didn't wearing pants.
You changed the rules, sir.
Oh, objection, Your Honor.
That's intense.
Yeah, welcome.
Are you ready, Counselor? I am, Your Honor.
50 years ago today, one of the most influential hip-hop artists of all time, Tupac Shakur, was born. But the rapper, actor, activist, and poet died violently after he was shot and killed in Las Vegas in 1996. Tupac's body of work continues to resonate 25 years after his death through his music, his words, and his visionary spirit. With more on Tupac's legacy, hip-hop historian Kevin Powell joins us on what would have been the artist's 50th birthday. Kevin, of course, is one of the New York cast members of the original The Real World and the reboot.
Good morning to you both. It's great to see you both. Thank you so much.
So, Kevin, you interviewed Tupac on several occasions. Help us understand the type of person he was outside of his role as an entertainer.
Well, it's funny you mentioned The Real World because that's actually how we met at Jack the Rapper in 1993, the summer of 93. I was a fan of his because of his role in the film Juice, which I thought was breathtaking, James Dean-esque, and little did I know that he was a fan of mine. I knew that I wanted to write a story for him, and literally it turned into 3 years of 4 cover stories over the course of time. And he was an incredible human being. There was a lot of, obviously, ups and downs in his life, things that people consider contradictions. But Tupac was a very honest, vulnerable, passionate human being. And it's funny because in that first article I did on him with him in his infamous straitjacket pose, I actually said he was the James Dean of the hip hop generation. And little did I know he would only live to 25, James Dean to 24. But we can see 28 years, 30, his 50th birthday, and all these years later since he died, 25 years since he died, he's become a global icon that rivals James Dean, Elvis, Marilyn Monroe, Bob Marley, a few people who we can say you can go anywhere in the world and people know Tupac's name. That's what he's become for so many different types of people.
Kevin, it's so funny. I'm kind of laughing right now because, like, right before the show started, I was talking to my husband, who is a serious hip-hop head, and we were talking about Tupac, and that's exactly the comparison. He said, you know, he's like James Dean. That's exactly what he said, so it's so interesting that you would bring that up. And the thing about him is, you know, he emerges during this era of, like, gangster rap, right? But this guy is like an incredible poet. He's aware of social issues. He weaves them into his lyrics. What do you think he would be writing about today?
Oh my gosh. You know, first of all, if you go back, there's MTV clips where he talked about in an interview Donald Trump and greed back in the early 1990s. This is someone who wrote songs like Keep Your Head Up and Dear Mama, which I believe foreshadowed things like the Me Too movement. This is someone who talked a lot about racism in his country, which certainly foreshadowed the Black Lives Matter movement. I believe that Tupac Shakur would have become a spokesperson in a way that we haven't seen in a long time. I think his impact would have been comparable to what John Lennon represented in his post-Beatles life, what Marvin Gaye represented, you know, what's going on, what Bob Marley represented, what Nina Simone represented, what Joni Mitchell's represented. You know, we didn't really get to see the totality of his genius. And I also believe that his greatest impact would have probably been as an actor. I mean, imagine Tupac Shakur, and I love Chadwick Boseman, and rest in peace to my friend Chadwick Boseman, but imagine Tupac Shakur in the Black Panther film, given his background as a son, literally, of a Black Panther, Afeni Shakur, his late mother.
Yeah, Kevin, I agree with you that I believe, just as an amateur film buff, that Juice, Tupac's performance in Juice is one of the most incredible, most searing performances I've ever seen for an actor debuting. I think it was his first film role, right? Debut on the screen. I absolutely agree that it is like James Dean or Marlon Brando in The Wild One. I mean, that was sort of what I thought of when I saw Pac in that film, because the movie's it's a great movie, and all the performances are excellent, but I was riveted. It was just, I'd never seen anything up to that point on screen like this. But, you know, and so he was more than just a rapper, which maybe a lot of people may just recognize him as such. He was an actor, he was a poet. He went to the Baltimore School for the Arts with Jada Pinkett Smith, who shared a never-before-seen poem written by Pac on the eve of what would have been his 50th birthday. I want to play some of that.
Some say nothing gold can last forever. And to believe this, I need no proof. I have witnessed all that was pure in me and be changed by the evil men can do. The innocence possessed by children once lived inside my soul, but surviving years with criminal peers has turned my warm heart to cold. I used to dream and fantasize, but now I'm scared to sleep, petrified not to live or die, but to awaken and still be me. It is true that nothing gold can last. We will all one day see death. When the purest hearts are torn apart, lost souls are all that's left. Down on my knees, I beg of God to save me from this fate. Let me live to see what was gold in me before it's all too late.
This poem, Kevin, was written while he served time on Rikers Island. You interviewed him there in 1995. Help us, our viewers, understand his past, how that shaped who he was. And did you have a sense that his tragic end, that his story would end in the way that it did? Did you see any signs? Or, because I think for a lot of people, they will look at his life, especially after he got out of prison, and wonder, it didn't have to be this way.
Yeah. Let me say this. You know, I'm trying not to get emotional here because it is his 50th birthday, but, you know, I literally did 3 cover stories for Quincy Jones's Vibe magazine on Tupac, and then I was in Vegas when he died. It was a cover story for Rolling Stone, and I'm literally working on a book now that'll be out in 2 years, 2023, the 50th anniversary year of hip hop, about Tupac Shakur. And I've done a deep dive into his life in ways that a lot of folks have not in our profession. And, you know, his mother, you can't talk about his life without talking about Afeni Shakur, and her being a Black Panther, her being a part of the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power movement, him literally being born into this cross-section of women's rights and Black rights and the gay liberation movement, all those things that happened as he was being born in 1971. Literally, you know, being targeted from an early age because of who his family was politically, the attacks we've learned in the years since through the media and released files that there's been things around the FBI pursuing, you know, targeting people. We just saw the movie that got nominated for an Oscar about Fred Hampton Sr., pardon me. And so Tupac very much was aware of all of that. And I believe that that's why he felt he was not going to live a long life. And when I did that interview at Rikers Island, he said, I wanted to tell the whole truth. I'm trusting you, Kevin Powell. In fact, he said to me when he was alive, he wanted me to be Alex Haley to his Malcolm X, because I think he believed as a young man, he only lived to 25, that he would not have a lot of time, which is why he gave me so much and so much exclusivity. And I remember leaving Rikers Island, Emery and Vlad, and just really wishing that I could take him with me. But I also remember his publicist, Karen Lee, saying at the time, this is probably the only quiet moment Tupac will have in his life, literally while he's sitting in this jail for these months, which was about a year. And that's really tragic when you think about it. And the last time I talked to him, it was for the famous Death Row cover story with him and Suge Knight and Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg on the cover, mimicking the famous Casino movie poster. And I remember just saying, what can we do to stop this growing East Coast, West Coast thing, this thing between you and Biggie and Suge and Diddy at the time? And I think he was just trying to figure out what was happening in his life. He was angry about getting shot the first time, but I also do believe, sadly, that he didn't think he was going to live a long time, which is why he compressed so much into his life in a short period of time, literally making movies up to the last minute, making music up to the last minute. And it's I'll say this because I try to find hope in Tupac's life, that he did more in 25 years than many people will do in 75 years or 100 years of life. And there's some lessons there that I think are invaluable for us about race, around gender, around manhood, around mental health, things that I've learned that I'll reveal in the book in 2 years that have been really incredibly profound. And I just hope that wherever people enter into Tupac's life, they're able to see some of the good, even with some of the things that are negative, some of the things that he said about folks, like Biggie, the things that were said about women, the sexual assault charge, which he maintained his innocence around until the end of his life, but he did say to me in that interview in prison that I'm not guilty of hurting this woman, but I am guilty of not stopping my male friends from doing something to this woman, which is huge for a man to say in spite of what he was under, the pressures he was under. So he was a lot of things to a lot of people. And what I want to do, and I want people to do, is to humanize him and see the whole picture, not just thug-like, not just gangster, not just this rapper, but this is someone who loved Shakespeare, who loved ballet, who wrote this incredible emotional poetry that Jada Pinkett read. He was a complex human being.
I think that about, well, if you could sum it up, I guess that about sums it up. I guess that the point is, when you say complex, it's difficult to sum up. But Kevin, that was really great. And it was really sort of good to kind of revisit some of your interviews with him, kind of give me a moment to kind of really remind myself why people love him and love his work even to this day, why so many people are still inspired by him. Kevin, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
That'll do it here for now. I'll see you again tomorrow morning at 7 Eastern for CBSN AM. Our colleague Tanya Rivero takes over after a short break, so keep it right here. You're streaming CBSN, CBS News, always on.
It's a good time for people like us. Everything's starting up.
This is not just another streaming app.
You might want to hold on to something.
This is a mountain of original, bingeable entertainment.
It's just the beginning.
The world is now a blank page.
That's why we're here, to save each other.
This is chilling, unsettling, and brilliantly bonkers. Oh, This is weird and hilarious, stylish and cheeky.
I imagine she dreams of casting me aside like an old Jew.
Oh, honey, you know I'd never throw away a shoe.
This is a joy to watch, a wonder to explore, and a peak TV experience.
We are such stuff as dreams are made of.
I'm so happy! Yay!
Live sports, breaking news, and a mountain of entertainment. Paramount Plus, now streaming.
Football, soccer, whatever you want to call it, it's huge. It's the best and biggest competition. You have a golden opportunity now or never. Oh, yes!
Oh, they done it!
Unbelievable!
It's not over yet.
The UEFA Champions League. Stream every match live on Paramount Plus.
Let's get this party started.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Paramount Plus. This is strokes of genius, beautiful games, and one shining moment. This is Defenders, Investigators, and
7 strangers picked to live in a house.
This is young SpongeBob, young Sheldon, and younger. This is everything you've been looking for.
That's gonna leave a mark.
Live sports, breaking news, and a mountain of entertainment.
All right.
This is Paramount Plus, now streaming.
Whose stories are worth telling? Who's it worth hearing? Never let anyone decide that for you.
This is not just another streaming app. This is love taps, death traps, and whip snaps.
Oh, shh.
This is things that go boom and things that go boom. This is justice. This is fearless.
This is business.
This is all the drama you can handle.
You must go. Make your stand.
Live sports, breaking news, and a mountain of entertainment. Paramount Plus, now streaming.
That bird has been staring at me. It's been there for 10 minutes.
Okay. I didn't know we were coming, or I didn't wearing pants.
You changed the rules, sir.
Oh, objection, Your Honor.
That's intense.
Yeah, welcome.
Are you ready, Counselor? I am, Your Honor.
Biden, Putin, face to face with the world watching. COVID, computer hacking, human rights. Can these two powerful leaders find common ground? Nora O'Donnell is in Geneva for this historic summit tonight on the CBS Evening News.
Good evening from our CBS newsroom in New York.
From the very beginning, CBS News has looked for new ways to reach people.
Today, that mission to tell the story of all our lives is stronger than ever.
It's important that we remember the story correctly.
A smart start to the day with facts first.
Unbiased reporting, making sense of our world every evening.
Who's responsible?
We found one hell of a story of survival.
CBS News. This is why.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya Rivero. Thank you for joining us. In any moment, President Biden will speak after holding talks with Russian President Putin in Geneva earlier. It was the first face-to-face meeting between the two world leaders since President Biden took office. The highly anticipated discussions finished in just under 3 hours. Tensions have been high between the two nations in recent years. Russia's recent acts of aggression against Ukraine were at the forefront of today's meeting. President Biden also addressed a recent surge in cyber attacks carried out by Russian hackers and a possible prisoner swap between the two countries. Following the summit, President Putin called the talks productive.
As for the first general appraisal, I think there was no hostility, quite the contrary. Our meeting took place, principally speaking, many of our positions. We don't share the same positions in many areas, but I think that both of these sides showed a willingness to understand one another and to find ways to bring our positions closer together. The talks were quite constructive.
Putin says the two countries have agreed to begin negotiations regarding the recent wave of cyber attacks. In addition, both countries will send their ambassadors to their respective posts in Washington and Moscow following the talks. Let's bring in our panel now. Ed O'Keefe, Christina Ruffini, and Timothy Fry. Ed is CBS News' senior White House and political correspondent. Christina is a CBS News correspondent. And Tim is a professor of post-Soviet foreign policy at Columbia University. He is also the author of Weak Strongman, The Limits of Power in Putin's Russia. Welcome to all of you. Such a great panel. Ed, let me begin with you. What are your biggest takeaways from President Putin's remarks following their meeting?
Well, I mean, he seemed to have kind words for the American president and suggested that they, or signaled that there still remain pretty significant disagreements over things like cyber attacks, political dissent within Russia, and potentially other issues. It seems to signal that there was some kind of an agreement on restoring diplomatic access, frankly, to the facilities that both have been kept away from by the host country, and trying to restore diplomatic engagement back to what it was before. There have been various tit-for-tats through the years in terms of property and how many personnel can be in either country. But he signaled, and we'll see if the president himself talks about this at all, that there may have been some resolution there. But, he called the American president conservative and balanced, somebody that he can engage with. Appreciated the fact that he brought up his family at times in the discussions. But clearly, there still remain some significant disagreements. And the fact that this wrapped up in under 4 hours, when the guidance from both sides had been it would be about 4 to 5, means it was either a really efficient meeting or perhaps that they just realized there wasn't anything more worth talking about here face to face.
Interesting. Yeah, that was the limit of this particular moment. So, Christina, there have been talks over efforts to have Americans released from Russia. What more can you tell us about this? Is there any potential prisoner swap in the works?
I mean, this is an ongoing issue, and I'm told it's something that was going to be brought up in the room. Now, I haven't gotten a hold of any of those people yet because the meeting is still breaking up to see if it was. But I think we can assume that one of the things that's really important to this president, as was the last president, was getting Americans who are detained overseas released. And that's been an ongoing issue. But prisoner exchange may not be the only way to do that. As Ed mentioned, there's a lot of concern over these different seized properties that have been confiscated on both sides through various diplomatic spats. And that could be something we see as well. There was an Israeli-American woman who was detained in Russia, and they said it wasn't a tit-for-tat, but, the Israeli government gave back some property to the Russian Orthodox Church, and then she was released. So that's something we could see as well. There are many different routes by which American diplomats and officials are trying to get Americans detained in Russia freed and brought back to the U.S., and that's a priority. But I've also been told that is a separate track from what they really wanted to accomplish at this summit. They were never planning to come out of this summit with an announcement that Vladimir Putin was letting, all wrongly detained Americans in Russia go. That's not, for better or worse, what this summit was about. This summit was about bigger geopolitical issues and starting a conversation on the two topics that these leaders really care about, and that's nuclear arsenals and cyber attacks, as well as a whole host of other issues that they need to address at smaller working levels. And hopefully this meeting could be the jumping off point. We talked about this, and then they can hand it off to their ministers, and then they can take the ball rolling from there.
And both presidents have agreed to have their ambassadors return to their respective posts in Washington and Moscow effective immediately. Christina, how significant do you think that decision is?
It's really important because, as Ed mentioned, it's diplomatic access. It's hard to facilitate any of these conversations if you don't have a representative in the country who can hold those talks face to face. That's why we have ambassadors. That's what ambassadors do. So it's important to note that neither of these ambassadors were officially PNG'd, which means they weren't officially kicked out of the country. But a couple months ago, when we had that big diplomatic spat, the U.S. sanctioned Russia and kicked out 15 Russian diplomats. Russia did the same, and then they made this rule that Russians can no longer work at the U.S. Embassy, which is going to be a big problem. The respective ambassadors got recalled home for consultations, which was like okay, let's have a cooling off period. Let's go home, check in with our bosses, and then we can all reevaluate. So the fact that they feel well enough, they're on the same page enough to send their ambassadors back to post is a big deal and a sign of progress. And hopefully those men can work out whatever needs to be done next.
So, Olivia, let's talk more about the recent cyber attacks. Criminal groups in Russia are believed to have carried out the ransomware attacks on Colonial Pipeline and GBS. Really significant stuff. So how did the two leaders address cyber issues today?
Tanya, I thought this was one of the most interesting parts of the presser that President Putin just delivered, because in typical fashion, he sought to turn the table on the United States, saying that the majority of cyber attacks are actually stemming from the United States, not from Russia, saying that Russia had raised dozens, as many as 45 demands with the United States for information regarding cyber incidents in Russia, including one on a major health facility that he alluded to, and had received no response. So he said, we've got some work on our plate in terms of sorting all of that out. He also said almost enthusiastically, it seemed like, that the U.S. and Russia are now going to engage in a consultation process, saying that that cyberspace is extraordinarily important, he said, to the United States and to some extent for Russia. So correcting for Vladimir Putin's tendency to exaggerate, to deflect, to offer up some potential falsehoods mixed in with truth, it was nonetheless a good reminder that as much as we hear about Russia's cyber activities here, the U.S. has pretty darn potent cyber capabilities of its own, including including offensive measures, some of which are very much unseen and some of which we only hear about after the fact. So we'll have to stay tuned to see if more information about what he alluded to actually becomes confirmed. But I think what he expressed today was that there's a recognition in Moscow. It will behoove Moscow as much as it behooves the United States to lay down some ground rules for what the rules of engagement are in the cyber domain, what is going to be tolerated, and what is crossing a line. And that's especially significant, I mean, in the United States, given these incidents that you mentioned, JBS, SolarWinds, the Colonial Pipeline attack, ransomware attacks from cyber criminals operating within Russia. They're really not very distant in the rearview mirror to the extent that they're in the rearview at all. So this will be a very important part of the discussions going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can imagine some sort of guidebook, being made up between the two countries, really clearly illustrating what's acceptable and what's not, that could be very useful. Tim, I want to turn to you now, being our, resident Putin expert. You heard President Putin say that today's talks were constructive. What more did you take out of his presser there? What does this summit signal for diplomacy? And remind us, what relations have been like up until this point, and what's at stake here for President Putin?
So both sides went out of their ways to underline that the stakes in this summit were pretty low, and that there was a really narrow agenda that each wanted to focus on: strategic security and cybersecurity. What I took away from Putin's press conference is, A, he's really good at these things. He's been doing it for 21 years. I also saw that the Putin's responses were largely geared toward a domestic audience within Russia. And he offered very little insight about what was discussed. He described the American side and President Biden as professional and constructive and balanced and hoped for good relations. But there were precious few details. But what we got was the greatest hits of U.S. misdeeds in the world and U.S. problems at home, everything from Abu Ghraib to drone killings in Afghanistan, to the January 6th events, to the high murder rate in the United States, and on and on and on. So this was clearly directed at a domestic audience. And I think for Putin, the domestic audience was very important, in part because his popularity ratings have sagged in recent years. The economy has been stagnant for about a decade. The propaganda within Russia is not working as effectively as it has in the past. There are parliamentary elections coming up in September, and it's good for Putin to remind Russians that he is able to play as an equal with the United States and is willing to poke his finger in the eye of the U.S. as needed.
So I believe we did lose Ed's connection for the moment, so we're down a panelist, but hopefully we will get him back. Christina, this is not the first time these two leaders have met. Describe a little bit to us their relations from the past and how they seem to have either stayed the same or evolved today.
Well, I'm certainly no Ed O'Keefe. Hopefully we'll get him back soon, but I'll do my best. Look, these two guys have been around for a while, right? Neither of them are neophytes. Neither of them have never been to a summit before. As vice president, now President Biden met Vladimir Putin multiple times around the world, and they've also been watching each other's trajectories. They've both been in power some form or another for decades, so this is not a new game. The interesting thing about these two men is they've been around long enough to have been working in the government during the Cold War and to watch that evolution up through the 90s, to watch what we thought was going to be a reset with U.S. and Russian relations after 9/11. Russia was very helpful in giving the U.S. access to places it needed so that it could go into Afghanistan. There was the famous Secretary Hillary Clinton reset button, but really there was no reset. And as we've seen, it's gone from bad to worse. And I think it's important to note, people keep saying Russian relations are at, a low point. But in the last couple years, there hasn't really been a high point. It's been a difficult, troubled relationship. And that's because these are two very powerful countries with very differential competing ideals. So it's never going to be, Russia and the U.S. just don't see the world through the same lens. So you're working from a starting point that's different right away. So that's already a problem. But these two men, like I said, they've been around, they know each other, they know the game, they know how this works, and they're both serious players. So they're going to get in there, and I don't think there's a lot of BS, for lack of a better term. They both came into the room with things that they wanted to do, and we'll have to see how much they were able to accomplish that in the weeks weeks and months to come as, this kind of filters down through the staff and the people who actually will take this to action.
Right. Olivia, I want to get back to what we were talking about earlier, that the U.S. and Russia will begin these consultations over cybersecurity issues, because I think that's really, really interesting. Do we have any more details around what this might entail? And how has Russia responded to previous efforts from the U.S. to deter Russian interference?
Yeah, Tanya, I think a lot of people are on tenterhooks for more of those details. We don't really know yet what the consultations are going to look like, who they're going to involve. You'll assume that there will be at more of a working level than the principals who discussed the matter today, although it is meaningful, of course, that there appears to be some overlap in this Venn diagram of interest between the U.S. and Russia within the cyber domain, because, again, as we've talked about, those rules of the road don't really exist right now. When you ask about deterrence and how well it's worked vis-a-vis Moscow in the past, I think in a phrase you can say not so well. You can recall even during the Trump administration, a more favorably disposed administration, the Russians were very swiftly named and shamed for their 2016 election interference. The U.S. issued a series of sanctions, diplomatic expulsions. Cyber Command later took down some Russian entities, took them offline ahead of the 2018 midterm elections, when we knew the Russians were going to go engage in interference another time. And did any of that work? I think that you can point to the ample evidence that has characterized these roiling past few months of Russian activity in SolarWinds, the ransomware attacks that have at least the silent acquiescence of the Russian government, if not its encouragement. That interference in 2018 and 2020, it suggests that they are very much undeterred by everything that the Americans brought at them up until now. And so it's unclear whether the new package of sanctions that the Biden administration brought earlier this year had any other material effect. This is your regular reminder that deterrence in the cyber domain is very, very hard. It's not established. There are no international norms or treaties governing this behavior. So to the extent that these two very significant cyber players are admitting, okay, we need to stop and identify some red lines, is again very, very meaningful.
Very meaningful. I find this piece of it almost the most interesting thing to come out of their summit. But Tim, I also want to ask you about some of the things that the Russians have been doing ahead of today's meeting that are sort of interesting. The Russian Navy was spotted west of Hawaii. In addition, the Russian military has built up its troops along the border with Ukraine in recent weeks. Are these sorts of tactics common for Russia ahead of these meetings, the sort of military flexing?
Yes, the Kremlin signaled openly that they were going to send some uncomfortable signals to the United States in the run-up to the summit as a warning, and the build-up along the Ukrainian border of Russian troops, and it was not that close to the border, and it was done in a very open fashion to make sure that the U.S. saw it, was clearly a signal that Russia has tools that it can use in eastern Ukraine should it choose to do so. And of course, the Russians then withdrew, having sent the message. There was also the decision to label Alexander Navalny's organization, the Foundation Against Corruption, as extremist. And it's interesting, in the press conference today, President Putin made what I thought was a very strong case for why the decision was made to ban Navalny's organization. I mean strong, not in the sense that it was logically strong, but this was a message that he clearly wanted to send, and he clearly rehearsed, accusing Navalny of being...
If you ask me what sort of a partner, what sort of a conversational partner Biden is, I'd say he's very constructive, he's very balanced.
I said outside, I think it's always better to meet face to face.
We don't share the same positions in many areas, but I think that both of these sides showed a willingness to understand one another.
There are areas where we can't cooperate if he chooses.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm Norah O'Donnell in Geneva. The setting for this historic meeting, the summit between President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin. That meeting wrapped up a short time ago, and we have already heard from the Russian president. Let's bring in our chief White House correspondent, Nancy Cordes here. Of course, President Putin getting the first crack at the press to describe this meeting, and his tone was conciliatory.
Right, and we'll now find out whether all the things that he asserted in that press conference were true, because he made a lot of claims. He said that the two sides had agreed to work together on allowing their respective ambassadors back into their countries. He said that they had agreed to work on cyber attacks. He said that they spoke about the invasion of Ukraine, but not in a detailed way. And all in all, he heaped a lot of praise on President Biden, which I think probably came as a surprise to the Americans as well. He called him balanced, professional, experienced. He said he had attractive moral values. He even said we speak the same language, and said that speaking with him for 2.5 hours was very unusual, something he doesn't normally see from other foreign leaders. So according to President Putin, it was a success. We'll see what President Biden has to say.
President Putin also took some tough questions from the international press, including his repression of political dissidents or opponents at home. He deflected those questions and instead bringing up what has happened in the United States. He brought up the Black Lives Matter protests. He brought up the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol. Putin never admitting anything that the United States accuses him of.
Right. When it comes to all the allegations against him, he continues to say they're not true. He continues to turn them around on the United States, saying it's the U.S. that is cracking down on human rights when, for instance, people who broke into the Capitol on January 6th were arrested. He talked about gun violence in the United States and said, we don't want that kind of thing in Russia, and so that's why we crack down on people who break the law. When it comes to Alexei Navalny, which was a big flashpoint, Nora, in these conversations, he would not guarantee Navalny's safety. He said that Navalny broke the law by coming back into Russia, that he knew he was breaking the law, and that he deserved to be put in prison.
He also claimed at one point that the United States funds political opposition within Russia, which we believe is untrue, that the United States does that. He also, in response to questions about Navalny's imprisonment and human rights, President Putin responding, well, Guantanamo is still operating now. The accusation that, of course, that prison in Cuba engages in human rights abuses against political prisoners of the United States. Let's listen now to the President of the United States.
I know it was easy getting into the pre-meeting. There was no problem getting through those doors, was it? Was there? Anyway, hello, everyone. Well, I've just finished the last meeting of this week's long trip, the U.S.-Russian summit. And I know there were a lot of hype around this meeting, but it's pretty straightforward to me, the meeting. One, there's no substitute, as those of you who have covered me for a while know, for face-to-face dialogue between leaders. None. And President Putin and I had share a unique responsibility to manage the relationship between two powerful and proud countries. A relationship that has to be stable and predictable. And we should be able to cooperate where it's in our mutual interest. And where we have differences, I want President Putin to understand why I say what I say and why I do what I do, and how we'll respond to specific kinds of actions that harm America's interest. Now, I told President Putin my agenda is not against Russia or anyone else. It's for the American people. Fighting COVID-19, rebuilding our economy, reestablishing relationships around the world with our allies and friends, and protecting the American people. That's my responsibility as president. I also told him that no president of the United States could keep faith with the American people if they did not speak out to defend our democratic values, to stand up for the universal and fundamental freedoms that all men and women have, in our view. That's just part of the DNA of our country. So human rights is going to always be on the table, I told him. It's not about just going after Russia when they violate human rights. It's about who we are. How could I be the President of the United States of America and not speak out against the violation of human rights. I told him that unlike other countries, including Russia, we're uniquely a product of an idea. You've heard me say this before again and again, but I'm going to keep saying it. What's that idea? We don't derive our rights from the government. We possess them because we're born, period. And we yield them to a government. And so the forum, I pointed out to him that that's why we're going to raise our concerns about cases like Alexei Navalny. I made it clear to President Putin that we'll continue to raise issues of fundamental human rights, because that's what we are. That's who we are. The idea is we hold these truths self-evident, that all men and women, we haven't lived up to it completely, but we've always widened the arc of commitment and included more and more people. And I raised the case of two wrongfully imprisoned American citizens, Paul Whelan and Trevor Reed. I also raised the ability of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty to operate and the importance of a free press and freedom of speech. I made it clear that we will not tolerate attempts to violate our democratic sovereignty or destabilize our democratic elections, and we would respond. The bottom line is, I told President Putin that we need to have some basic rules of the road that we can all abide by. I also said there are areas where there's a mutual interest for us to cooperate. For our people, Russian and American people, but also for the benefit of the world and the security of the world. One of those areas is strategic stability. You asked me many times, what was I going to discuss with Putin before I came? I told you I only negotiate with the individual, and now I can tell you what I was intending to do all along. And that is to discuss and raise the issue of strategic stability and try to set up a mechanism whereby we dealt with it. We discussed in detail the next steps our country should take on arms control measures, the steps we need to take to reduce the risk of unintended conflict. And I'm pleased that we agreed today to launch a bilateral strategic stability dialogue. Diplomatic speak for saying get our military experts and our diplomats together to work on a mechanism that can lead to control of new and dangerous and sophisticated weapons that are coming on the scene now, that reduce the times of response, that raise the prospects of accidental war. And we went into some detail of what those weapon systems were. Another area we spent a great deal of time on was cyber and cybersecurity. I talked about the proposition that certain critical infrastructure should be off limits to attack, period, by cyber or any other means. I gave them a list. If I'm not mistaken, I don't have it in front of me, 16 specific entities, 16 defined as critical infrastructure under U.S. policy, from the energy sector to our water systems. Of course, the principle is one thing. It has to be backed up by practice. Responsible countries need to take action against criminals who conduct ransomware activities on their territory. So we agreed to task experts in both our countries to work on specific understandings about what's off limits and to follow up on specific cases that originate in other countries, in either of our countries. There's a long list of other things we spent time on, from the urgent need to preserve and reopen the humanitarian corridors in Syria so that we can get food, just simple food and basic necessities, to people who are starving to death. How to build it and how it is in the interest of both Russia and the United States to ensure that Iran does not acquire nuclear weapons. We agreed to work together there because as much as Russia's interest is ours. And to how we can ensure the Arctic remains a region of cooperation rather than conflict. I caught part of President Putin's press conference, and he talked about the need for us to be able to have some kind of modus operandi where we dealt with making sure the Arctic was, in fact, a free zone. And to how we can each contribute to the shared effort of preventing the resurgence of terrorism in Afghanistan. It's very much in the interest of Russia not to have a resurgence of terrorism in Afghanistan. There are also areas that are more challenging. I communicated the United States' unwavering commitment to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We agreed to pursue diplomacy related to the Minsk agreement, and I shared our concern about Belarus. He didn't disagree with what happened. He just has a different perspective of what to do about it. But I know you have a lot of questions, so let me close with this. It was important to meet in person, so there can be no mistake about or misrepresentations about what I wanted to communicate. I did what I came to do. Number one, identify areas of practical work our two countries can do to advance our mutual interest and also benefit the world. Two, communicate directly that the United States will respond to actions that impair our vital interest or those of our allies. And three, to clearly lay out our country's priorities and our values, so we heard it straight from me. And I must tell you, the tone of the entire meetings, I guess it was a total of 4 hours, was good, positive. There wasn't any strident action taken. Where we disagreed, I disagreed, stated where it was. Where he disagreed, he stated. But it was not done in a hyperbolic atmosphere. That is too much of what's been going on. Over this last week, I believe, I hope, the United States has shown the world that we are back, standing with our allies. We rallied our fellow democracies to make concerted commitments to take on the biggest challenges our world faces. And now we've established a clear basis on how we intend to deal with Russia and the U.S.-Russian relationship. There's much more work ahead. I'm not suggesting that any of this is done. We've gotten a lot of business done on this trip. And before I take your questions, I want to say one last thing. Folks, look, this is about how we move from here. I listened to, again, a significant portion of what President Putin's press conference was. And as he pointed out, this is about practical, straightforward, no-nonsense decisions that we have to make or not make. We'll find out within the next 6 months to a year whether or not we actually have a strategic dialogue that matters. We'll find out whether we work to deal with everything from release of people in Russian prisons or not. We'll find out whether we have a cybersecurity arrangement that begins to bring some order. Because look, the countries that most are likely to be damaged failure to do that are the major countries. For example, when I talked about the pipeline that cyber hit for $5 million, that ransomware hit in the United States, I looked at him and said, well, how would you feel if ransomware took on the pipelines from your oil fields? He said it would matter. This is not about just our self-interest. It's about a mutual self-interest. I'll take your questions, and as usual, folks, they gave me a list of the people I'm going to call on. So, Jonathan, Associated Press.
Thank you, sir. U.S. intelligence has said that Russia tried to interfere in the last two presidential elections and that Russia groups are behind hacks like SolarWinds and some of the ransomware attacks you just mentioned. Putin, in his news conference just now, accepted no responsibility for any misbehavior. Your predecessor opted not to demand that Putin stop these disruptions. So what is something that concrete, sir, that you achieved today to prevent that from happening again, and what will the consequences you threaten?
Whether I stopped it from happening again, he knows I will take action, like we did when this last time out. What happened was we, in fact, made it clear that we were not going to continue to allow this to go on. The end result was we ended up withdrawing, they went withdrawing ambassadors. We closed down some of their facilities in the United States, etc. He knows there are consequences. Now, look, one of the consequences that I shouldn't say this, is unfair of me. I suspect you may all think doesn't matter. But I'm confident matters to him, I'm confident matter to him and to other world leaders of big nations. His credibility worldwide shrinks. Let's get this straight. How would it be if the United States were viewed by the rest of the world as interfering with the elections directly of other countries, and everybody knew it. What would it be like if we engaged in activities that he is engaged in? It diminishes the standing of a country that is desperately trying to make sure it maintains its standing as a major world power. And so it's not just what I do, it's what the actions that other countries take, in this case Russia, that are contrary to international norms. It's the price they pay. They are not able to dictate what happens in the world. There are other nations of significant consequence, i.e. the United States of America being one of them.
Mr. President, just a quick follow on the same theme of consequences. You said just now that you spoke to him a lot about human rights. What did you say would happen if opposition leader Alexei Navalny dies?
I made it clear to him that I believe the consequences of that would be devastating for Russia. I'll go back to the same point. What do you think happens when he's saying it's not about hurting Navalny, all the stuff he says to rationalize the treatment of Navalny, and then he dies in prison? I pointed out to him that it matters a great deal when a country, in fact, and they asked me why I thought it was important to continue to have problems with the president of Syria. I said because he's a violation of international norm. It's called the Chemical Weapons Treaty. It can't be trusted. It's about trust. It's about their ability to influence other nations in a positive way. Look, would you like to trade our economy for Russia's economy? Would you like to trade? And by the way, we talked about trade. I don't have any problem with doing business with Russia as long as they do it based on international norms. It's in our interest to see the Russian people do well economically. I don't have a problem with that. But if they do not act according to international norms, then guess what? That only won't happen with us. It will not happen with other nations. And he kind of talked about that, didn't he, today? About how the need to reach out to other countries to invest in Russia. They won't, as long as they are convinced that, in fact, the violations, for example, the American businessman who was in house arrest, and I pointed out, you want to get American business to invest, let him go. Change the dynamic. Because American businessmen, we're ready to show up. They don't want to hang around in Moscow. I mean, look, guys, I know we make foreign policy out to be this great, great skill that somehow is sort of like a secret code. All foreign policies is a logical extension of personal relationships. It's the way human nature functions. And understand, when you run a country that does not abide by international norms, and yet you need those international norms to be somehow managed so that you can participate in the benefits that flow from them, it hurts you. That's not a satisfying answer. Biden said he'd invade Russia. It's not, By the way, that was a joke. That's not true. But my generic point is, it is more complicated than that. David Sanger. I thought I just saw David. There he is.
Thank you, Mr. President. In the run-up to this discussion, there's been a lot of talk about the two countries spilling down into a Cold War. And I'm wondering if there was anything that you emerged from in the discussion that made you think that
With your permission, I'm going to take my coat off. The sun is hot.
Anything that would make you think that Mr. Putin has decided to move away from his fundamental role as a disruptor, particularly a disruptor of NATO and the United States? And if I could also just follow up on your description of how you gave him a list of critical infrastructure in the United States, did you lay out very clearly what it was that the penalty would be for interfering in that critical infrastructure? Did you leave that vague? Did he respond in any way to it?
Let me answer your first. Well, I'll answer your second question first. I pointed out to him we have significant cyber capability, and he knows it. He doesn't know exactly what it is, but it's significant. And if in fact they violate these basic norms, we will respond. Cyber. He knows in the cyber way. Number two, I think that the last thing he wants now is a Cold War. Without quoting him, which I don't think is appropriate, let me ask you a rhetorical question. You got a multi-thousand-mile border with China. China is moving ahead, hell-bent on election, as they say, seeking to be the most powerful economy in the world, the largest, and the most powerful military in the world. You're in a situation where your economy is struggling. You need to move it in a more aggressive way than in terms of growing it. And I don't think he's looking for a Cold War with the United States. I don't think it's about as I said to him, I said, your generation and mine are about 10 years apart. This is not a kumbaya moment, as he used to say back in the 60s in the United States, like, let's hug and love each other. But it's clearly not in anybody's interest, your country's or mine, for us to be in a situation where we're in a new Cold War. And I truly believe he thinks that. He understands that. But that does not mean he's ready to, quote, figuratively speaking, lay down his arms and say, come on. He still, I believe, is concerned about being, quote, encircled. He still is concerned that we, in fact, are looking to take him down, etc. He still has those concerns. But I don't think they are the driving force as to the kind of relationship he's looking for with the United States. Jennifer Jacobs.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. President. Is there a particular reason why the summit lasted only about 3 hours? We know you had maybe allotted 4 to 5 hours. Was there any reason it ran shorter? Also, President Putin said that there were no threats or scare tactics issued. Do you agree with that assessment, that there were no threats or scare tactics?
Yes.
And also, did you touch on Afghanistan and the safe withdrawal of troops?
Yes, and yes. Let me go back to the first part. The reason it didn't go longer is when the last time two heads of state have spent over 2 hours in direct conversation across the table, going into excruciating detail. You may know of time, I don't. I can't think of one. So we didn't need, as we got through when we brought in the larger group, our defense, our intelligence, and our foreign, my foreign minister wasn't foreign minister, my Secretary of State was with me the whole time. Our ambassador, etc. We brought everybody in. We had covered so much. And so there was a summary done by him and by me of what we covered. Lavrov and Blinken talked about what we had covered. We raised things that required more amplification or made sure we didn't have any misunderstandings. And so it was kind of after 2 hours there, we looked at each other like, okay, what next? What is going to happen next is we're going to be able to look back, look ahead in 3 to 6 months and say, did the things we agreed to sit down and try to work out, did it work? Are we closer to a major strategic stability talks and progress? Are we further along in terms of and go down the line? That's going to be the test. I'm not sitting here saying because the President and I agreed that we would do these things, that all of a sudden it's going to work. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is I think there's a genuine prospect to significantly improve the relations between our two countries without us giving up a single solitary thing based on principle and our values. No, there were no threats. There were, as a matter of fact, I heard he quoted my mom and quoted other people today. Well, it was very, as we say, which will shock you coming from me, somewhat colloquial. And we talked about basic fundamental things. And you know how I am. I explain things based on personal basis. What happens if, for example. And so there were no threats, just as simple assertions made, and no, well, if you do that, then we'll do this, with anything I said. It was just letting him know where I stood, what I thought we could accomplish together, and what, in fact, if there were violations of American sovereignty, what we would do. No, he asked us about Afghanistan. He said that he hopes that we're able to maintain some peace and security, and I said that has a lot to do with you. He indicated that he was prepared to, quote, help on Afghanistan. I won't go into detail now, and help on Iran, and help on, and in return, we told him about what we wanted to do relative to bringing some stability and economic security, or physical security, to the people of Syria and Libya. So we had those discussions. Yamiche.
Thanks so much, Mr. President. Did you say that you didn't issue any threats? Were there any ultimatums made when it comes to ransomware? And how will you measure success, especially when it comes to these working groups on Russian meddling and on cybersecurity?
Well, it's going to be real easy. They either, for example, on cybersecurity, are we going to work out where they take action against the ransomware criminals on Russian territory? They didn't do it. I don't think they planned it in this case. And are they going to act? We'll find out. Will we commit? What can we commit to act in terms of anything affecting, violating international norms that negatively affects Russia? What are we going to agree to do? And so I think we have real opportunities to move. And I think that one of the things that I noticed when we had the larger meeting is that people who are very, very well informed started thinking, you know, this could be a real problem. What happens if that ransomware outfit were sitting in Florida or Maine and took action, as I said, on their single lifeline to their economy, oil? It'd be devastating. And they're like, you could see them kind of go, oh, we'd do that, but like, whoa. So it's in everybody's interest that these things be acted on. We'll see, though, what happens from these groups we put together. The third one, yes, go ahead.
Mr. President, when President Putin was questioned today about human rights, he said the reason why he's cracking down on opposition leaders is because he doesn't want something like January 6th to happen in Russia. And he also said that he doesn't want to see groups formed like Black Lives Matter. What's your response to that, please?
My response is kind of what I communicated, but I think that's a ridiculous comparison. It's one thing for literally criminals to break through cordon, go into the Capitol, kill a police officer, and be held unaccountable, and it is for people objecting and marching on the Capitol and saying, you are not allowing me to speak freely. You are not allowing me to do A, B, C, or D. And so they're very different criteria. Steve Holland, Reuters.
President Putin said he was satisfied with the answer about your comment about him being a killer. Could you give us your side on this? What did you tell him?
He's satisfied. Why would I bring it up again?
And now that you've talked to him, do you believe you can trust him?
Look, this is not about trust. This is about self-interest and verification of self-interest. That's what it's about. So I virtually almost anyone that I would work out an agreement with that affected the American people's interest, I don't say, well, I trust you, no problem. Let's see what happens. You know, as that old expression goes, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. We're going to know shortly. Igor, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty.
Hello, Mr. President. Hello, Mr. President.
You want to go in the shade? You can't. Can you see?
Thank you. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So I think you know attacks in civil society and the free press continue inside Russia.
Yes.
For example, Radio Free Europe.
Yes.
Radio Liberty, Voice of America, Current Time TV channel where I work, branded foreign agents, and several other independent media. So we are essentially being forced out in Russia 30 years after President Yeltsin invited us in. My question is, after your talks with President Putin, how interested do you think he's in improving the media climate in Russia?
I wouldn't put it that way, in terms of improving the climate. I would, in fact, put it in terms of how much interest does he have in burnishing Russia's reputation that is viewed as not being contrary to democratic principles and free speech. That's a judgment I cannot make. I don't know. But it's not because I think he's interested in changing the nature of a closed society or closed government's actions relative to what he thinks is the right of government to do what it does. It's a very different approach. You know, there's a couple of really good biographies. I told him I read most everything he's written and the speeches he's made, and I've read a couple of very good biographies, which many of you have as well. And I think I pointed out to him that Russia had an opportunity, that brief shining moment after Gorbachev and after things began to change drastically, to actually generate a democratic government. But what happened was it failed, and there was a great race among Russian intellectuals to determine what form of government would they choose and how would they choose it. And based on what I believe Mr. Putin decided was that Russia has always been a major international power when it's been totally united as a Russian state, not based on ideology, whether it was going back to Tsar and commissars straight through to the revolution, the Russian Revolution, and to where they are today. And I think that it's clear to me, and I've said it, that I think he decided that the way for Russia to be able to sustain itself as a great, quote, great power is to, in fact, unite the Russian people on just the strength of the government. The government controls, not necessarily ideologically, but the government. And I think that's the choice that was made. I think I'm not going to second guess whether it could have been fundamentally different, but I do think it does not lend itself to Russia maintaining itself as one of the great powers in the world.
Thank you, sir. Did military response ever come up in this conversation today? Did you, in terms of the red lines that you laid down, is military response an option for a ransomware attack? And President Putin had called you in his press conference an experienced person. You famously told him he didn't have a soul. Do you now have a deeper understanding of him after this meeting?
Thank you very much.
But on the military response, sir?
No, we didn't talk about military response.
In the spirit, Mr. President, you saying that there is no substitute for face-to-face dialogue, and also with what you said at NATO, that the biggest problems right now are Russia and China. You've spoken many times about how you have spent perhaps more time with President Xi than any other world leader. So is there going to become a time where you might call him, old friend to old friend, and ask him to open up China to the World Health Organization investigators who are trying to get to the bottom of COVID-19?
Let's get something straight. We know each other well. We're not old friends. It's just pure business.
So I guess my question would be, you've said that you were going to press China. You signed on to the G7 communique that said the G7 were calling on China to open up, to let the investigators in. But China basically says they don't want to be interfered with anymore. So what happens now?
The impact, the world's attitude toward China as it develops. China's trying very hard to project itself as a responsible and very, very forthcoming nation. That they are trying very hard to talk about how they're taking and helping the world in terms of COVID-19 and vaccines, and they're trying very hard. Look, certain things you don't have to explain to the people of the world. They see the results. Is China really actually trying to get to the bottom of this? One thing we did discuss, as I told you, in the EU and at the G7 and with NATO, what we should be doing, and what I'm going to make an effort to do, is rally the world to work on what is going to be the physical mechanism available to detect early on the next pandemic and have a mechanism by which we can respond to it and respond to it early. It's going to happen. It's going to happen, and we need to do that. Thank you.
What did Putin say about Paul Whelan and Trevor Reed? What did he say about Paul Whelan and Trevor Reed?
I have hopes. I say again, we can't hear you. I said the families of the detained Americans came up and we discussed it. We're going to follow through with that discussion. I am not going to walk away on that.
Why are you so confident he'll change his behavior, Mr. President?
Yeah, I'm not confident in changing behavior. What the hell? What do you do all the time? When did I say I was confident?
You said in the next 6 months you'll be able to determine.
What I said was, let's get it straight. I said what will change their behavior is if the rest of the world reacts to them and it diminishes their standing in the world. I'm not confident of anything. I'm just stating the fact.
But given his past behavior has not changed, and in that press conference after sitting down with you for several hours, he denied any involvement in cyber attacks. He downplayed human rights abuses. He even refused to say Alexei Navalny's name. So how does that account to a constructive meeting as President Putin framed?
You don't understand that. You're in your own business.
Is the summit with China next?
Cool, we need to load. Cool, we need to load quickly. Let's go. Quickly, cool.
And there you have it, the President of the United States answering questions of Russia, saying, I don't think Putin is looking for a new Cold War with the United States. He's not looking for a kumbaya moment. Let's bring in Nancy Cordes, our chief White House correspondent. Some significant developments here, particularly on cyber attacks.
That's right. He said that the two sides have agreed to work together. He handed Vladimir Putin a list of critical infrastructure that should not be hacked under any circumstances, described that as his red line. And he says now we'll see in the next 6 to 12 months whether Putin abides by what they discussed and whether they can make progress.
Let's bring in Ian Bremmer. He is a best-selling author and columnist who's covered Russia for 3 decades, also president of the Eurasia Group. And Ian, good to have you here. President Biden also saying that he told Putin we have significant cyber capabilities in the United States and we will respond in kind. This is the threat that Biden wanted to deliver in person, right?
Yeah, this is the vulnerability that Biden has. Over the course of the past months, it's not just espionage against the United States, it's also unprecedented and exponentially growing ransomware, hitting everything and everybody. And the Russians, Biden said in the presser, it's not the Kremlin planning it directly, it's not the Kremlin behind it directly, but they know what's going on and they're not doing anything about it. And if Biden doesn't stop that, if he doesn't either get engagement with the Russians to put an end to it, or he doesn't take significant action against Russia, he's going to be seen as really failing in this relationship. He did deliver the message. He basically said, give some patience. We're going to open a strategic dialogue. We'll have consultations. The Russians have complaints about the U.S. too, as I'm sure they do, and give it 6 months to see if it's going to work. I will tell you, Nora, I am much more skeptical than President Biden displayed in the last few minutes of this press conference that he's going to get any satisfaction on this one.
Ian Bremmer, thank you. I want to bring in Michael Morell, former acting and deputy director of the CIA, also a CBS News senior national security contributor. Michael, it is so good to have you. I know you've studied Russia closely when you were at the CIA. The message, too, that Biden delivering, that Putin's credibility on the world stage shrinks, in his word, if he does not respond in kind and if he continues this type of behavior. What did you make of this meeting?
So I thought it was positive, Nora, in the sense that both sides had a long conversation. It seems that both sides were candid with each other. It seems that both of them talked about the details involved in these issues. That's a good thing. But I do think there is a very significant gulf between the two countries that is going to be difficult to bridge. Putin said numerous times that the United States is out to remove him from power, is pushing democracy in Russia, wants to see him removed. He really believes that. That's not true, but he really believes that. That drives a lot of his behavior. And I think his bad behavior around the world, including many of the things he does against us, is driven by that. So without that changing, and I don't see it changing, the bad behavior is going to continue.
You don't think that Putin ends any of his dirty tricks after this conversation with President Biden?
No, I don't. And I also want to emphasize what Ian said. It is not going to be easy to change Russian behavior on the ransomware attacks. Some of these organized crime bosses who do this are political supporters of President Putin. There's an enormous amount of money involved here. And many of the individuals who are doing the hacking are Russian intelligence officers who do national security espionage during the day, and they work for organized crime at night. So this is a very difficult thing for Putin to take action against.
It's an excellent point, as always. Michael Morrell, good to have you. And President Biden saying we will find out in the next 6 months to the year whether or not we have a strategic dialogue that matters. Our coverage will continue on our streaming network, CBSN, your local news, and we'll have more tonight right here on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Norah O'Donnell in Geneva, Switzerland.
For news 24 hours a day, go to cbsnews.com.
Let's get this party started.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Paramount Plus. This is strokes of genius, beautiful games, and one shining moment. This is Defenders, Investigators, and
7 strangers picked to live in a house.
This is Young SpongeBob, Young Sheldon, and younger. This is everything you've been looking for.
That's gonna leave a mark.
Live sports, breaking news, and a mountain of entertainment.
All right.
This is Paramount Plus, now streaming.
Whose stories are worth telling? Who's worth hearing? Never let anyone decide that for you.
This is not just another streaming app. This is love taps, death traps, and whip snaps.
Oh, shit.
This is things that go boom and things that go boom. This is justice. This is fearless.
This is business.
This is all the drama you can handle.
You must go. Make your stand.
Live sports, breaking news, and a mountain of entertainment. Paramount Plus, now streaming.
That bird has been staring at me. It's been there for 10 minutes.
Okay.
I didn't know we were coming, or I didn't wearing pants.
You changed the rules, sir.
Oh, objection, Your Honor. That's intense.
Yeah, welcome.
Are you ready, Counselor? I am, Your Honor.
Football, soccer, whatever you want to call it, it's huge. It's the best and biggest competition.
You have a golden opportunity now or never. Oh, yes!
Oh, they done it!
Unbelievable!
It's not over yet.
The UEFA Champions League. Stream every match live on Paramount Plus.
We are here to get you up to speed on all the news that you need to know.
Trusted, true journalism.
Because the wind is so strong, there are no airdrops.
When did you start to feel that anxiety?
The best of CBS News. Streaming from anywhere the news is to everywhere you are.
Now they've had to expand to 3 hallways.
Morning news, served just the way you want it.
Here's a look at some of the stories that you may have missed while you were offline.
CBS and AM. Stream free, weekdays on CBSN.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya Rivero. Thank you for joining us. President Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin wrapped their historic meeting in Geneva, Switzerland. This is the first time the president has met with the Russian leader since taking office. The pair discussed a number of topics, ranging from climate change and human rights to allegations of election meddling and cyber hacking. Unlike past presidential meetings with foreign leaders, Mr. Biden and Putin held separate press conferences afterwards. Putin called the talks constructive, but President Biden took a firmer stance on work that still needs to be done.
The bottom line is I told President Putin that we need to have some basic rules of the road that we can all abide by. I also said there are areas where there's a mutual interest for us to cooperate. For our people, Russian and American people, but also for the benefit of the world and the security of the world.
For more, I want to bring in Ed O'Keefe, Elizabeth Palmer, Christina Ruffini, Olivia Gazis, Dan Patterson, and Heather Conley. Elizabeth is CBS News senior foreign correspondent. Christina is a CBS News correspondent. Olivia is a CBS News intelligence and national security reporter. Dan is our tech reporter. And Heather Conley is the senior vice president for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic. She is also the director for the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for helping us form this fantastic panel. Ed, let me start with you. After listening to both President Biden's post-meeting presser and President Putin's, do they seem to be on the same page in terms of how the meeting went and what was agreed upon?
So far, I think we're going to learn more details, obviously, Tanya, in the coming hours and days about what specifically went on in those conversations and whether there's real disagreement. But you heard them both broadly talk about the concept of sorting out at a lower level details of arms control to ensure that the treaties that are in place will continue well into the 2020s. Talk about cybersecurity. They both seem to acknowledge that cyber hacks, cyber war is going to continue, but they may be starting to outline where exactly is the no-go zone when it comes to that kind of conflict. The president saying he presented the Russian president with a list of critical infrastructure that he believes should be off limits in these kinds of situations, and that if it isn't, then there would be a more intensified American attack. He suggested that there are cyber capabilities the United States has, Russia may or may not be totally aware of. On top of that, he said he outlined what he calls strategic stability. This is what he'd been teasing throughout the week when he was asked, what are you going to talk to the Russian president about? He said, I'll tell you after the meeting. Strategic stability, as he sees it, is an ability for these two countries to coexist and deal with their own national interests, but do it in a way that doesn't lead to unintended conflict around the world and some other kind of either actual war or Cold War. As you heard him say, he doesn't want another Cold War. And then issues like Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine, and the fate of two Americans, Paul Whelan and Trevor Reed, saying off microphone as he walked away that he thinks the two families are going to be in for some good news at some point. That's encouraging to those two families. We spoke with the Reed family yesterday, who says they want to hear more and they wanted to know that things were moving in a positive direction. And it sounds like from what he hinted at here today that that is the case. He is now on his way to the airport and set to fly home to Washington. The Russian president no longer here at this 19th century villa either. So in essence, the show here in Geneva has wrapped up.
All right. And Elizabeth, remind us what is at stake for both countries coming out of today's meeting. What are both the U.S. and Russia looking for? And are these two leaders satisfied with the results from today?
Well, I think President Putin will have to have been satisfied. He got what he wanted, which was a great, big, elaborate summit with the President of the United States, where he appeared as an equal on the world stage. And that will be good for his prestige at home. It's going to take some time to know whether we should take him at his word. He did say that he wanted, if you like, a reset on cyber attacks. He said, listen, Russia's been a victim too, and that a panel of experts, maybe a working group of some description, had to be established to nail down the facts. That could be code for we will take a look at the red lines, maybe put out a few of our own, and work out modus vivendi, where nobody gets hurt and there aren't dangerous escalations. He really signaled that he wanted to continue talks in many ways. And there was a funny moment where he said, look, we didn't stare into one another's eyes and claim to see one another's souls. We didn't pledge eternal love, but it was pragmatic. It was a good working meeting. And he really had some conviction in his voice when in several places he said, we're going to go forward and have more constructive talks. A sign that that diplomatic opening is beginning is the fact that the ambassadors are going to be allowed to return. The U.S. ambassador to the embassy in Moscow and the Russian ambassador to the embassy in Washington. They'd been recalled in April at a particular low point, and they'd been literally working from home. So they're going to go back, and that's a good sign, because when the ambassador's in post, then all kinds of back-channel talks can go forward.
And Elizabeth, was there any easy common ground between these two leaders, opportunities for them to sort of easily agree to work together, such as maybe in climate change, for instance?
Well, the one that President Putin identified was work on the Arctic. He said that the northern sea route is going to be of interest and benefit to everybody, and that Russia had no interest in militarizing the Arctic, and it wished to work with the United States. Of course, the border between the U.S. and the Arctic is closest in the Bering Sea. So that could be an easy one to establish some trust and some really important contacts. He did say climate change. He said the epidemic, but the Arctic was the one that he really got fired up about.
Mm-hmm. And Christina, unlike past presidents, President Biden did not hold a joint press conference with President Putin. Why was that? Can you tell us a little bit about why they chose to do separate press conferences and why it's significant?
Well, there's a few reasons for that. One of them was they were worried about ghosts of Helsinki, which is when President Trump did that joint press conference with President Putin and said, he believed President Putin over his own intelligence officials as far as whether or not he'd meddled in the election. They didn't want a repeat of that. They also didn't want the Russian press and the U.S. press to be put in a position where the Russian press was propping up President Putin and asking him kind of leading, easy questions that he would be able to hit out of the park. They really wanted to be able to separate it and have President Biden answer questions from his own press corps. And they didn't want it to get out of control. They wanted to control the environment. And the Russians had their press conference, and President Biden had his press conference. Look, these events are always advanced. They plan everything down to every second, every minute, every arrival, or at least they try to. And that very rarely goes to plan. As we saw earlier today, there was a big kerfuffle with the two press corps. There were more Russian press corps than they had anticipated. The U.S. press corps had trouble getting in the room. The summit ended a little earlier than we were expected, and President Biden was asked why that was, and he said they went through the list. They got through their agenda. They made it happen. One of the other things that I thought was interesting when Ed was talking about one of the objectives of this was for the U.S. to lay out those guardrails. This is the things we will not accept cyber attacks on, and you, Russia, whether it's you with the government or someone within your territory, you have to make sure this doesn't happen or there's going to be consequences. One of the things we were looking for is what those consequences would be. And President Biden was asked at the end of the press conferences if he ever threatened a military response, and he said no. He said the U.S. has its own very explicit cyber capabilities, and they will use them if necessary. But one of the questions would be, had this gotten far enough where the U.S. would say, look, if you hit our critical infrastructure, we're going to come back with a kinetic response, which is military. And it seems like they're not there yet. They've warned the Russians. President Biden has spoken his piece and said, don't do this, and we'll have to see whether they do or not.
I want to deep dive a little bit more into what the two leaders discussed in terms of cyber attacks. But Heather, I want to turn to you now and ask you about Russia's occupation near Ukraine's eastern border. What did these two world leaders talk about in terms of Ukraine? How was that handled?
Yeah, we really need to, I think, return to some of those areas where there's the deepest division between the United States and Russia, and that is Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and its continued occupation of nearly 7% of Ukraine. Russia's rapid military mobilization in April and May of this year was in some ways one of the genesis of this actual summit meeting. U.S. leaders were really concerned that they didn't understand whether this was an exercise, a prelude to perhaps a further Russian military incursion into Ukraine. Look, this problem hasn't been solved since 2014. 14,000 Ukrainians have died, 1.5 million displaced. This is still a very hot conflict. Again, what President Biden wanted to see was trying to create a little more stability and predictability about Russia's military mobility, its exercises, we have a lot of exercises coming up in this region, both U.S. exercises in the Black Sea region, as well as the Baltic Sea, and Russia has a massive annual military exercise coming up later in the summer and early fall. We need to make sure we have transparency and predictability, and we need to start getting Russia to move back from from Ukrainian territory. I think this is going to be very difficult for the two leaders to solve. Perhaps they can create some greater transparency, but Mr. Putin is not going to give an inch on Ukraine. Belarus now is increasingly in his orbit. As I said, this is going to be an area where the two can talk about their concerns, but I don't see really any immediate resolution. And of course, the Ukrainian people are suffering for that.
And what is, Russia, or at least Russia as it exists under President Putin? What are the long-term designs on Ukraine? Is he hoping to annex it? I mean, otherwise, why would he be concerned about, its effort to join NATO?
Well, there are two critical things. Obviously, President Putin is trying to create a buffer zone between Russia and NATO, and making sure that former Soviet states, such as Ukraine and Belarus, do not try to join the West. Now, in 2014, for Ukraine, that meant joining or signing a trade agreement with the European Union. It didn't mean joining NATO. In fact, Ukraine's constitution at that time prohibited membership in NATO. Of course, Russia's annexation and invasion completely changed that, and now you have Ukrainian President Zelensky wanting to be closer to the EU and to NATO. But again, NATO, there has to be unanimous consent for any new member to join, and that unanimous consent does not exist. But the more that Russia places forces on Ukraine's border, continues to apply enormous pressure, we're going to see more Russian military activity near the border in Belarus this summer. This will have to, increase NATO's force posture, certainly in the Baltic states and in Poland. So this is where we're trying to get some greater transparency to make sure we don't misunderstand Russian military activities the way we were very concerned just in April of this year.
Absolutely. And Dan, I want to turn to you now to talk a little bit more about what was discussed today regarding these cyber attacks that, as you know, are directly affecting Americans. Experts have said that Russia is using Ukraine as a hacking test site before launching similar tactics in the U.S. And, we've already seen these hacks in the U.S. traced back to Russia in recent weeks with the Colonial Pipeline and JBS. There's also the SolarWinds hack. Of course, as you and I have discussed, it's sort of unclear who exactly, they're being sourced to Russia, but it's unclear who exactly is doing that, whether it's criminal gangs, whether it's the Kremlin, whether it's a little bit of both. But I think that is going to make this piece of it so complicated, because let's say that a lot of these cyber attacks, the ones involving ransoms, are being done by criminal gangs. A lot of these criminal gangs support President Putin, and they give him lots of kickbacks, I'm sure. I'm sure he gets some financial benefit out of it. So how can he control that sort of criminal element?
Tanya, at the beginning of this segment, you asked where Biden and Putin perhaps existed in the same realities. When it comes to cyber, they exist in a totally different reality, or at least this is what they expressed during this meeting. Of course, we know Putin and Russia are incredibly sophisticated with cyber, but during this meeting, Putin denied everything. In fact, he claimed the United States was the #1 instigator of cyber attacks, followed by Canada. Also, as you stated, Tanya, this is incredibly important. Although there might be criminal operators in Russia, nothing happens in Russia without Putin's either tacit or sometimes explicit knowledge, including ransomware. And let's be clear, Ukraine was and remains a test bed for cyber attacks targeting critical infrastructure. If we want to learn the lessons of what's happening right now, we should look at what happened in Ukraine in 2016 and 17. In fact, I was there just after the Russian cyber army took down Ukraine, Kiev's power grid. In fact, they were able to log in and actually move the mouse cursors while Ukrainian officials watched. Russia has significant cyber capability, and ransomware has emerged as one modern weapon. Of course, we also know that the modern origins of ransomware extend back to not just the United States and our NSA's capabilities, but Russia's shadow brokers group, which swiped the United States cyber weapons and created a ransomware variant that is now spreading and has spread across the world. We also know that many of these cybercrime gangs are able to operate kind of nimbly or flexibly, and although they can appear as though they are separate from Russia and the Russian government, a lot of the cryptocurrency financing seems to link the two entities.
And so, Dan, how was all of this addressed during today's meeting in terms of what the U.S. response would be? We saw President Biden ask that question, whether that included a military response, and he seemed to indicate it didn't include a military response. So is the threat then one of cyber warfare?
Yeah, so Biden, in fact, spelled this out pretty significantly. Right after he enumerated the 16 components of the United States critical infrastructure, where he said, hey, look, one of the things we need to do is say certain pieces of infrastructure, which you can find on the CISA website, should be off limits. He said that the United States will respond, quote, with significant cyber. And look, he was vague. He didn't spell out precisely what the United States will do, but we do know that under the Trump administration, the United States kind of shifted from a defensive posture to a more offensive posture. So although it's unlikely we will know the particulars, the specifics, I think that it would be hard to imagine a scenario where we don't use offensive and perhaps a blend of offensive and kinetic proportional responses.
Right. Christina, one of the other topics up for discussion today was human rights and political prisoners, including the treatment of opposition leader Alexei Navalny. What more can you tell us about that? And was any headway made on the effort to release Americans being held in Russia through a possible exchange?
Well, I mean, as Ed O'Keefe just said, both leaders essentially said talks are still ongoing. They're in progress. And Ed said, the president said when he got off the podium, a little off mic, I wasn't able to see it here, but he said he might have some positive news for those families soon. When it comes to Alexei Navalny, President Putin was asked about his treatment. And one of the questions that we've heard over and over again is what happens? How does the U.S. respond if Navalny dies in prison? President Putin said, look, he will be treated the same as any other prisoner in Russia. He didn't say that he would allow him to die. He didn't say he would not allow him to die. And it's kind of a macabre question. But the bigger issue here, I think, is how President Putin responded to those general questions about human rights. And that's he threw it back at the United States. He talked about Black Lives Matter. He talked about protest movements here. And that's something we're seeing more and more frequently when the U.S. brings up human rights with countries like Russia. We saw it with China. I was in that meeting between senior officials of the U.S. and the Chinese in Alaska, and it was the same thing there. The U.S. side brought up human rights issues, the treatment of the Uyghurs, and the Chinese said, you have your own human rights issues. Look at your movements. Look at how you treat African-American people. So it's interesting. It's a conversation, all politics are local, and it's very hard to get people often to care about foreign policy. As someone who loves foreign policy, it kind of breaks my heart a little bit. But it goes to show you that these domestic problems can be used on a greater international stage, where if the U.S. is not showing a good example, it becomes harder for the U.S. to promote human rights overseas. Now, I'm not saying this is a valid comparison at all. I'm just saying this is a line that we've seen now from the Chinese and from the Russians when we try to address what we see are human rights issues, and they say, you know what, fix your own problems first.
I also thought it was interesting the way President Putin punted a question when he was asked about jailing his political opponents and, his treatment of political opponents. He pivoted to talking about, the Black Lives Matter protests and saying, while we sympathize for the American people, we don't want to have that kind of disorder on our streets. It's sort of a very interesting perspective that he takes it as an issue of order, and he does not want, any political opposition that somehow bleeds into disorder, the way he sees it.
Right. Well, strongman leaders in general don't like people to do things they're not supposed to do. And there have been significant crackdowns, as we've seen, not only on protesters, but as on freedom of the press, on press outlets. One of those press outlets got a question with President Biden today, and I'm sure that was a deliberate move by the White House to say, all right, well, you think these people are government agents? We're going to give them a question here and show you what it's like to have free press. But President Putin, experts we've talked to, and I've talked to some people who are working in Russia, I wouldn't say he's terrified of Alexei Navalny, but he's worried about the precedent that it sets. He's worried that any opposition leader, even if Navalny is not the guy that most Russians want to take over the presidency, he's not Putin. And the fact that there are protests and there is enough support for him among the international community that he can't just do away with him, right? There's so much attention on him, there's so much light on him, that in a way that protects Navalny in prison because the whole world is watching, and Putin knows that. So it's a precarious position for him to be in, because one opposition leader could lead to two, could lead to three. So he wants to keep a lid on that. At the same time, the rest of the world is saying, hey, this is not how this works. You need freedom of speech and you need freedom of political parties. And that doesn't really exist right now in Russia.
And it does get a little messy sometimes when people disagree. Olivia, I want to ask whether we learned any more about Russia's potential link to Havana syndrome, whether that was discussed at today's meeting.
Right, Tanya, you might think of that item as notably absent from the range of issues that were raised today. And I suppose we can't say for certain where the closed-door conversation went. It's possible that in those limited 3 hours it was also raised, but indications were going into these talks that it wasn't going to be. And I think that's chiefly because the attribution to Russia isn't quite there. Even though there's lots of suspicion circulating among the intelligence community, victims of these incidents, and among senators on the Hill who have been briefed on the intelligence, including Democratic senators who are persuaded that these are attacks originating in Russia. When the Secretary of State was asked bluntly about this during a congressional appearance last week, he essentially said, if and when we establish that a state actor is behind these incidents, that's when we will take it to them. So he was not keen on saying that we know that this is Russia and we intend to raise it. The U.S. government is, of course, still completing an intelligence review of these incidents. And unlike the cyber incursions, the ransomware attacks, we don't have a U.S. agency at this point saying, SVR, we know it was you, pointing at the finger publicly or even privately and saying we have the fingerprints that we need to attribute these incidents to Russia. So that is an area that is going to still have, that the U.S. still needs to do some legwork on, and presumably will be raised in forthcoming engagements to the extent the attribution actually comes through.
All right. Thank you so much, Olivia Gazis. We did have to let Elizabeth and Ed go earlier, but thanks to the rest of you for sticking around and joining us. Christina, Olivia, Dan, and Heather, we appreciate it. We want to take you now to Geneva, where moments ago President Biden spoke following talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Let's watch.
I thought, quite frankly, I was in a much better position to represent the West after the previous 3 meetings with Putin, that knowing that the rest of the West was behind us. And so I think, so I owe them all a debt of gratitude.
Mr. President, since you're now heading home, can I just ask you briefly about 2 domestic issues?
I'm not sure I can answer them, but
if you could. First would be this fate of the infrastructure bill. There's now a bipartisan group that has a new offer. Have you had time to review it?
No,
okay.
I've not been. I honestly haven't seen it. I don't know what the details are. I know that my chief of staff thinks there's some room, that there may be a means by which to get this done. And I know that Schumer and Nancy have moved forward on a reconciliation provision as well. So I'm still hoping we can put together the two bookends here.
And the second issue is that yesterday, or earlier this week, Mitch McConnell said that if Republicans were to take back the Senate in 2022, he did not see a way that you could get a Supreme Court justice confirmed. Do you have a response to that? This would be next year.
No, I know. The answer is Mitch has been nothing but no for a long time, and I'm sure he means exactly what he says, but we'll see.
Mr. President, did you talk with President Putin about the Iran nuclear deal? Did you find a way? What did you discuss, and did you find a way to make
it was
some progress?
about how we would jointly work, and I'm not going to discuss what we discussed.
Do you have any?
Mr. President, Caitlin's question that you answered at the very end there, that you came over to talk about. I think at the heart of it was this question of whether or not you seem overly optimistic, given that what we all listen to President Putin essentially say the same old things that he said forever. He's, rejecting all responsibility for all that stuff. And I guess the question that she was trying to get, and maybe you could take another stab at it, is what concrete evidence do you have from these 3+ hours that suggests that any movement has been made? And I don't mean that.
No. I know, but you're all. Look, to be a good reporter, you got to be negative. You got to have a negative view of life. Okay, it seems to me the way you never ask a positive question. Why, in fact, having agreement? We'll find out. We have an agreement to work on a major arms control agreement. I started working on arms control agreements back all the way during the Cold War. If we could do one in the Cold War, why couldn't we do one now? We'll see. We will see whether or not it happens. But the thing that always amazed me about the questions, and I apologize for having been short on this before. If you were in my position, would you say, well, I don't think, man, anything's going to happen. It's going to be really rough. I think it's going to really be bad. You guarantee nothing happens. You guarantee nothing happens.
So there's a value
far, there's a value to being realistic and put on an optimistic front, an optimistic face. Look, you all said the same thing about the, what was going to happen when we had the first meeting of the seven. Oh, Biden, they're not going to buy Biden stuff. They're really not really. Any of you find that? Did that happen? Any of it? A little bit, just a little sliver of it. When I went to meet with NATO, oh boy, they're not going to be happy. They're all going to be against Biden meeting with Putin. They're not going to want that. Did you hear a single solitary syllable? And what would have happened if I had said, before I went into those negotiations, I think it's going to be really hard. I think it's going to be really difficult. I'm not so optimistic about it. I don't see anybody really changing. And the same way when I met with the EU. The EU's not going to like the way Biden's operating.
But this is Vladimir Putin.
Sure, it's Vladimir Putin. But look, it was also I don't compare him to Putin, but it was the French president said he will never go for more money for NATO. Guess what? He's agreed. Look, guys, I'm going to drive you all crazy because I know you want me to always put a negative thrust on things, particularly in public, and negotiate in public. I don't have to trust somebody. We didn't have to trust somebody to get START 2. It wasn't about a trust. Well, I trust the Russians. I can tell, man, they're really, I've been looking at them. Very stupid. You have to do self-interest. They're self-interest. I don't trust anybody. Look, I've got to get in the plane, but I'll say it. You'll hear me say this more than once.
You can go when you want.
Yeah, no, but here's the thing, folks. I don't see any benefit ever to begin a negotiation. And I mean, you're the brightest people in the country. You're the most informed people on detail. I'm not being solicitous. You are. But it makes no sense for me to negotiate with you. It makes no sense for me to tell you what I'm about to do. It makes not because I want to hide anything from you. Why would I telegraph that?
Did he do anything that surprised you? Was there any
moment that you were surprised by?
No, I wasn't surprised because I was convinced that, I'm going to choose my words, Russia's in a very, very difficult spot right now. They are being squeezed by China. They want desperately to remain a major power. You all are writing about, not illegitimately, Biden already gave Putin what he wants, legitimacy, standing on the world stage at the President of the United States. They desperately want to be relevant. They have, and they don't want to be known as some critics have pointed and said, the upper Volga with nuclear weapons. It matters. And I've found it matters to almost every world leader, no matter where they're from, how they're perceived, their standing in the world. It matters to them. It matters to them in terms of their support at home as well. And so I think that there is I'm trying to think how to shorten this so I can get in the plane. I'm of the view that in the last 3 to 5 years, the world has reached a fundamental inflection point about what it's going to look like 10 years from now. I mean it literally. It's not hyperbole. It's not like I'm trying to pump it up. I think it's a genuine reality. And so each of the countries around the world, particularly those who had real power at one time or still do, are wondering, how do I maintain and sustain our leadership in the world? That's what the United States is going through right now. How do we sustain us being the leading, most powerful, and most democratic country in the world? A lot's going on. I don't know about you. I never anticipated, notwithstanding, no matter how persuasive President Trump was, that we'd have people attacking and breaking down the doors of the United States Capitol. I didn't think that would happen. I didn't think I'd see that in my lifetime. But it's reinforced what I've always known and what I got taught by my political science professors and by the senior members of the Senate that I admired when I got there. That every generation has to reestablish the basis in its fight for democracy. I mean, for real. Literally have to do it. And I've never seen, including since the Civil War, such an outward assault on voting rights. I mean, just a flat assault. I didn't anticipate that happening 4 years ago, but it's happening now. There's a lot at stake. Each of the countries, we have our own concerns and problems, but we still, as long as I'm president, we are going to stick to the notion that we're open, accountable, and transparent. And I think that's an important message to send the world. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Come back and see us on the plane.
You've been watching President Biden speaking with reporters as he departs Geneva following talks with President Putin. Reporters had his attention for quite a while there and asked him several questions, including whether any agreements with President Putin have the potential to materialize at all. President Biden replied by saying there's a value to being realistic and optimistic. We're going to take a quick break now, but we've got a lot more news ahead, so stay with us. You're streaming CBSN, CBS News, always on.
It's a good time for people like us. Everything's starting up.
This is not just another streaming app.
You might want to hold on to something.
This is a mountain of original, bingeable entertainment.
It's just the beginning. The world is now a blank page.
That's why we're here, to save each other.
This is chilling, unsettling, and brilliantly bonkers.